He walked away to save her and destroyed them both. Logan Pierce gave up the only woman who ever made him feel like enough. He thought leaving would protect her. He was wrong. Because while he was busy sacrificing his happiness, Vanessa Hartwell was losing everything she'd spent 12 years building, and the one thing no boardroom could replace. This is the story of two people too scared to fight for what they deserved, until a 5-year-old girl with a crayon and a piece of paper refused to let them quit. Drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The crane snapped at 6:47 in the morning. Logan Pierce heard it before he saw it. A sound like a gunshot wrapped inside a groan of tortured steel, followed by a deep metallic shriek that rolled across the entire south terminal of the Port of Seattle and sent seagulls exploding off the dock pilings in every direction. He was already moving before the second sound came, before his brain had fully registered what his body already knew. 20 feet of heavy-gauge cable whipped sideways through the cold February air and took out a section of guide rail like it was made of cardboard. Nobody got hurt. By some miracle of proximity and pure dumb luck, the dock crew nearest the collapse had moved to the coffee station 40 seconds earlier. Logan stood in the aftermath, chest heaving, staring at the buckled frame of a 14-ton gantry crane that would cost somewhere north of $60,000 to repair. And he did the math in his head the way he always did. Parts, labor, downtime. The shipping manager, a red-faced man named Greer, was already on his phone 40 yards away, gesturing at the wreckage and talking loud enough that Logan could catch every third word. He didn't need to hear all of it. He knew how this conversation was going to end. He pulled off his hard hat, wiped sweat off his forehead despite the 38-degree air, and crouched down beside the base of the crane to get a better look at the cable housing. The fraying was bad. Not the kind of bad that happened overnight. This had been building for months, maybe longer, which meant someone had been signing off on safety checks without actually doing them. Logan had been on this crew for 2 years, and he had flagged the cable housing on his maintenance log back in November. He had flagged it again in January. Nobody had called him back about it. He was still crouching there, turning a frayed section of cable over in his grease-blackened gloves, when Greer ended his call and walked over. The man had the energy of someone who was about to make everything Logan's problem. "Corporate's going to want a full incident report by end of day," Greer said. "I put it in the maintenance log twice," Logan said without looking up. "That's not what I asked." Logan stood up slowly. He was not a small man. 6'1", built from a decade of physical work, with the kind of stillness that sometimes made people unsure whether he was calm or simply deciding. "I know what you asked. I'm telling you what the incident report is going to say when I write it." Greer's jaw tightened. "You're saying this is a maintenance oversight." "I'm saying the cable housing was flagged in November and again in January, and nobody from the maintenance coordinator's office responded either time. That's in the log, with timestamps." He let that sit for a moment. "So yeah, that's what the report's going to say." They looked at each other for a few seconds. Then Greer turned and walked away without another word. Logan put his hard hat back on and started measuring the damage. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heating system that worked perfectly on the driver's side and not at all on the passenger side, which meant that on cold mornings, Mia sat bundled in her coat and hat even inside the truck, her breath making small clouds in the air while she narrated everything she saw through the window. "Fire truck, dog, bird sitting on that pole, Daddy. That one over there, the fat one." She was 5 years old and she had opinions about everything. Logan picked her up from the home of Mrs. Delacroix, a retired school librarian who lived 4 blocks from their apartment, and charged him $300 a month to watch Mia during his early morning shifts. It was a good deal, and he knew it. Mrs. Delacroix fed her breakfast, read to her, and occasionally taught her French words that Mia then deployed at random and completely out of context. Last week, Mia had told the cashier at the grocery store that her father was très fatigué, which was accurate and also embarrassing. "How was your morning?" he asked as she buckled herself into her booster seat with the focused concentration of someone diffusing a device. "Mrs. Delacroix said frogs sleep in mud," Mia announced. "Is that true?" "Some frogs, yeah." "That's disgusting." She thought about it. "I would do it if I was a frog, though." "Sure you would." Would you do it? Probably not. Because you're too big? Because I'm too old. She considered this philosophical distinction for a moment and then moved on to the fire truck she'd spotted, and Logan drove through the gray Seattle morning with one hand on the wheel and the coffee in the cup holder going cold because he kept forgetting to drink it. His phone buzzed twice from the passenger seat. He didn't look at it until they were parked outside Mia's preschool, a low brick building with crayon-colored window decals and a mural of cartoon animals that someone had painted on the exterior wall. Both texts were from his friend Danny Ruiz. The first one said, "Bro, I set something up for Friday. Don't say no." The second one said, "I'm serious. Don't say no. I already told her you're coming." Logan stared at both messages for a moment, then put his phone in his jacket pocket and walked Mia to the door. Listen. Danny Ruiz was the kind of person who thought that other people's problems were fundamentally logistics problems that could be solved with enough planning and enough unsolicited advice. He had been Logan's best friend for 11 years since they'd worked the same night shift at a machine shop in Tacoma, and in 11 years his central worldview had not shifted 1 degree. Danny believed in solutions. He believed in action. He believed that Logan's primary problem was not the dead-end maintenance job or the crumbling savings account or even the 6-year-old grief that Logan still carried around like something he'd swallowed whole and never fully digested. Danny believed Logan's primary problem was that he hadn't been on a date in 3 years. They argued about this at Danny's kitchen table on Thursday night while Mia sat in the living room watching an animated film about a rabbit that solved crimes, which was apparently a very compelling premise for 5-year-olds. "You set up a blind date," Logan said. "I set up an opportunity." "Danny. She's great. She's a professional. She's got her life together. Her name's Vanessa." "I don't want to be set up." "I know. You also don't want to eat anything that's not from a can, but here we are." Danny pushed a bowl of actual pasta across the table. "You haven't talked to a woman who wasn't Mrs. Delacroix or a dispatcher in literally years. That's not true. Name one." Logan opened his mouth and then closed it. "One woman," Danny said. "Not Mia, not Mrs. Delacroix, not your sister. She doesn't count." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're functional. Those are completely different things." Danny leaned back in his chair. "Mia's getting older. She's starting to notice stuff. She asked me last month why you never have anybody over." That landed harder than Logan expected. He looked down at the pasta he hadn't touched. "She's 5, he said. "She's 5 and she's watching every cartoon where there's a mom and a dad and wondering why her house looks different." Danny's voice had gone quieter, which was how Logan knew he meant it. "I'm not saying you have to marry anybody. I'm saying go eat dinner with a human woman and see what happens." From the living room, Mia laughed loudly at something the cartoon rabbit had done. Logan looked at the text on his phone again. "I already told her you're coming." "Where?" he said finally. Danny smiled in the specific way that meant he'd known all along how this was going to end. The restaurant was called Harborview Grill, which was the kind of name that set certain expectations. Dark wood, low lighting, a menu with prices that didn't include a dollar sign because you weren't supposed to need one. Logan had looked it up online and found it more or less confirmed those expectations. He'd stood in his apartment bathroom on Friday evening in a collared shirt that he'd had to dig out from the back of his closet, looking at himself in the mirror with the expression of a man arriving at a dentist's appointment he'd been dreading for months. Mia had sat on the bathroom counter eating crackers and offering commentary. "You look nice," she said. "Thanks, Bug." "Where are you going?" "Dinner." "Who with?" "A friend." She gave him a look that was pure Mrs. Delacroix. One eyebrow slightly raised, skeptical, patient. "A friend you don't know yet?" He had no idea how she knew that. "Sort of. Is it a girl?" "Mia." "Uncle Danny told me it was a girl." He was going to have a conversation with Uncle Danny about appropriate disclosure boundaries. "Yeah, it's a girl." Mia nodded, satisfied, and ate another cracker. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone granting permission. Mrs. Delacroix arrived at 6 to stay with Mia, and Logan drove to Harborview Grill through Friday evening traffic, telling himself the whole way that it was just dinner. It was one dinner. Nothing had to happen. He was just going to eat food across from a stranger, and that was the entire commitment he'd made. He sat at the bar with a glass of water and waited. Bull. Vanessa Hartwell arrived 8 minutes late, which she was already aware of and already frustrated about because she had left her office 40 minutes early specifically to avoid arriving late and then hit a traffic situation on the Alaskan Way Viaduct that had no good explanation. She walked into Harborview Grill in a deep burgundy dress and a blazer, and she had redone her lipstick in the Uber and was still deciding if she'd gotten it right. She had told herself 3 times on the ride over that she was only doing this because her assistant, Priya, had spent 2 weeks making the case that Vanessa needed to spend some amount of time outside of the office doing something that was not work, and because Priya had eventually deployed the specific argument that Vanessa had no hobbies, no social life, and no evidence of ever having experienced a weekend in the traditional sense, all of which was accurate. She spotted the man at the bar before the hostess could intercept her, because he was the only person sitting alone looking like he was waiting for something unpleasant to begin. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a collared shirt with a small paint scuff near the second button that he'd either missed or decided to live with. He had the hands of someone who worked with them. She noticed things like that, years of reading contractors and port managers and dock supervisors from across a conference table, and he was sitting very straight in a way that looked like discipline rather than comfort. She walked over. He looked up and she watched the recognition cross his face. Not the recognition of someone who knew her, but the recognition of someone realizing that this was the person he was here to meet. And then she watched something else cross his face immediately after, something that might have been surprise. And she had enough experience reading that particular sequence of expressions that her stomach tightened before he even said a word. She was a large woman. She had been her entire adult life. She had been told about it in every register human beings were capable of delivering information, bluntly, gently, cruelly, and in the specific indirect way that was worse than all of them. And she could identify the moment a person registered it in approximately half a second. She stood in the entrance of Harborview Grill and waited to see what Logan Pierce was going to do with his face. He stood up. "Vanessa," he said. "Yes," she said. "Sorry I'm late." The viaduct was a disaster. It always is. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm without being performative. "Logan?" "I know. Danny's told me about you." "Hopefully not too much." "Enough to know you work at the port and that you can fix basically any kind of machinery, which he described as," she searched her memory, "extremely useful in a friend and slightly terrifying in a person." Something shifted in Logan's expression. The tightness around his eyes eased just a fraction. "That sounds like Danny." They were shown to a table near the windows, which looked out over the water. Vanessa ordered sparkling water. Logan ordered the same and then looked slightly embarrassed about it, like he'd been planning to order something else and pivoted at the last second. "Do you actually want water, or are you just being polite?" she asked. "Honestly, I was going to get a beer, but please get a beer. You don't have to match me. I just don't drink on weeknights." "Friday's a weeknight." "I have an 8 a.m. call tomorrow." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "That's what Saturdays are for?" "Saturdays are for catching up on everything that didn't get done Friday." She said it matter-of-factly, without apology, the way she always explained her schedule, but she caught herself wondering afterward if it sounded wrong, too intense, too much. She'd been told before that she was too much. But Logan just nodded, like that made sense to him. "I do overtime most Saturdays. It's quieter on the dock." "Because fewer people are there?" "Because Greer's not there." She asked who Greer was. He explained, briefly, without editorializing, but she could hear the shape of the frustration underneath the economy of words. She ran a logistics company. She knew what it was to have managers who created more problems than they solved. "Do you like the work?" she asked. "The actual work, not Greer." He thought about it for a genuine moment, which she appreciated. Most people answered that question on instinct. "Yeah," he said. "When something's broken and I fix it, it's fixed. There's a clear result. You don't get that in a lot of jobs." "You really don't," she said. The beer arrived. The conversation loosened. Not dramatically. They were still 2 strangers in a restaurant doing the careful archaeology of getting to know each other. But the tight, formal quality of the first 10 minutes began to break down around the edges. She told him, because he asked, that she ran Hartwell Maritime Logistics. She said it the way she always tried to say it in non-business contexts. Plainly, without preamble, but she watched his eyes go through a series of quick adjustments. "The one with the terminals in Tacoma and Everett," he said, "and 3 others in Oregon." "Yes. I've worked jobs for Hartwell, subcontracted, a few years back. Small world. Very small." He looked at her in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but was more direct than she was used to from people who'd just learned what she did. "Danny didn't tell me you were a CEO?" she offered. "I was going to say that successful. He made it sound like we were at the same general altitude." "You're a skilled tradesman at one of the largest ports in the Pacific Northwest. You're not exactly struggling for dignity." He blinked. Then he laughed. Real laughter. Unexpected. The kind that loosened his whole face. "Okay," he said. "Fair." She smiled. And then, for the first time all evening, she felt something that wasn't the background hum of self-consciousness she carried into every social situation involving people who didn't know her. Just a moment of actual ease. She reached for her water glass and knocked it sideways across the table, and Logan caught it with one hand before it could go over the edge, water sloshing onto the tablecloth, but not onto either of them. "Good reflexes," she said. "Occupational hazard," he said, and handed the glass back to her. So, it was 40 minutes into dinner, and the conversation had found a rhythm. They had moved, as conversations do when 2 people are paying attention, through a series of topics that seemed unrelated but were actually building something. The way Seattle had changed in 10 years. The specific qualities that made a logistics problem interesting versus maddening. The fact that Mia, as Logan described her, had very strong opinions about frogs. Vanessa had leaned forward slightly when he mentioned his daughter, the way people do when they suddenly want to hear more, and Logan had given her the short version first, 5 years old, at home with a sitter, complete chaos in the best possible way. And then, because Vanessa seemed genuinely interested and not merely polite about it, he'd given her a slightly longer version. Her mother had left when Mia was 18 months old. Not dramatically. No screaming fight, no catastrophic revelation. Just the slow, clarifying realization on both their parts that they had built a life around a child they both loved and each other they didn't. And then the specific agony of figuring out what came next when the person who left didn't actually want to take Mia with her. He said all of this without self-pity and without performing resilience. He just said it, the way you describe terrain. This is what happened. This is how the ground lies. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long ago?" 4 years. So she was 1. 18 months. She doesn't remember her mother. Does she ask about her? Sometimes. Less than she used to. He turned his beer glass a quarter turn on the table. "I don't know if that's better or worse, honestly." "Probably both," Vanessa said. He looked at her. "Yeah. Probably both." Outside the restaurant's large windows, Elliott Bay was dark except for the navigation lights of a container ship moving slowly south toward the terminal. Logan watched it for a second. He'd worked the loading of ships like that one, in weather like this one, more times than he could count. He was about to say something, he wasn't sure what, but the conversation had arrived at one of those comfortable pauses that didn't require filling, when the hostess appeared at the edge of his vision and she was moving quickly. And something in her body language snapped Logan's attention to full alert before she even opened her mouth. "Excuse me, is there a child with your party? A little girl?" Logan was on his feet before the sentence was finished. "What happened?" "She came in through the side entrance. We think she followed someone. She's outside, near the street, and our host is with her, but she..." He was already moving. Mia had not meant to end up in the street. What had happened, as best she could later explain it, was that she had looked out the window of the Uber with Mrs. Delacroix. They had come to bring Daddy his jacket because it was cold and he'd forgotten it. And she had seen him through the restaurant window, sitting at a table, and she had gotten out of the car while Mrs. Delacroix was paying and walked toward the window to knock on the glass. And then someone had opened the side door of the restaurant and she'd gone through it because it seemed like the faster way. And then she was outside on the sidewalk and there was a gap in the parked cars. And the street was right there, and she had taken approximately 3 steps into it before everything happened at once. The delivery truck was moving slowly. It would not have hit her. Very possibly, it would have stopped in time. But the series of events that followed did not pause to assess probability. A figure came from the direction of the restaurant entrance. fast, faster than the situation quite seemed to call for. And Mia felt two strong hands close around her and pull her backward in one fluid motion, back onto the sidewalk, the delivery truck rolling past in the place she'd just been standing, the driver's face appearing briefly in the window with the specific expression of a person who has just had a very bad 5 seconds. Mia looked up. The woman who was holding her was large and warm, and her dress was burgundy, and she smelled like something good, something clean that Mia didn't have a name for. She was kneeling on the sidewalk now, her hands on Mia's shoulders, and she was breathing harder than the situation maybe called for, and her expression was the expression of someone who had been genuinely scared. "Are you okay?" the woman said. Her voice was lower than Mia expected, steady but with something shaking underneath it. "Can you tell me your name?" "Mia," said Mia. "Mia," the woman repeated. "I'm Vanessa. Are you hurt anywhere?" Mia considered the question carefully. "No," she said. "Are you?" Something happened in Vanessa's face that Mia couldn't entirely read, an expression like something softening under pressure. "No," Vanessa said. "I'm okay." Logan arrived approximately 6 seconds later, and the sequence of emotions that crossed his face as he took in the scene, his daughter standing on the sidewalk, apparently whole, in the arms of the woman he'd been having dinner with, was something that neither he nor Vanessa would find easy to describe afterward. He crouched down and pulled Mia against him with the kind of hold that meant he wasn't letting go for a while, and over her shoulder his eyes met Vanessa's. She was still kneeling on the cold sidewalk. One knee of her dress would never be quite the same. She was watching him hold his daughter with an expression she probably didn't know was on her face. "She's okay," Vanessa said. "She wasn't hit." "I know," Logan said, against the top of Mia's head. His voice had something in it that was working hard to stay level. "I saw." They stayed like that for a moment. Logan holding Mia, Vanessa kneeling on the sidewalk, the cold February air around them and the water in the background and the restaurant's warm light through the windows. Mrs. Delacroix appeared from around the corner, breathless and pale, hand at her chest. "Oh, thank heaven! Mia, I turned around and she spotted Vanessa. "Was it you? Did you get her?" "She's fine," Vanessa said. "She wasn't hurt." "My lord," said Mrs. Delacroix, sinking slightly against the building. Mia had emerged from her father's hold enough to look at Vanessa again. She studied her with the unselfconscious directness that 5-year-olds have about them, a look that most adults would find disconcerting and that Vanessa simply held still for. "You're fast," Mia said. Vanessa looked down at her own knees, then back up at Mia. "Yeah, well," she said, "apparently." They did not go back inside and finish dinner. Mrs. Delacroix took Mia back to the apartment after a prolonged period of reassurance and recrimination that she directed primarily at herself, and Logan and Vanessa stood on the sidewalk outside Harborview Grill in the cold and looked at each other in the specific way of two people who have just had a conversation interrupted by an emergency and aren't sure how to get back to where they were. "I'm sorry," Logan said. "I don't know what she was doing here. Her sitter brought her. I'm going to need to make a call." "Don't apologize, she's 5. Vanessa folded her arms against the cold. She'd forgotten her blazer inside. "She saw you through the window and wanted to say hi. That's not terrible instincts. It's pretty terrible spatial awareness." "She's 5, Vanessa said again. He looked at her. His hands were in his pockets. There was something he was deciding about. She could see it in the way he was holding himself. And then he said, "You didn't have to do that. I was closer. By maybe 3 steps. She looked down at the sidewalk. I didn't think about it. I saw her, and I moved." "I know." He paused. "Thank you." The words were simple and plain, and he meant them entirely, and she could hear all of that, and it landed somewhere inside her that had not been reached by anything in a long time. She had been thanked before. She had been thanked extravagantly, in the way that wealthy women sometimes are, with an elaborate performance of gratitude that was really about the thanker managing their own feelings. This was different. He just meant it. "Do you want—" She hesitated. It was unusual for her to hesitate. She was not a person who generally hesitated. "They could probably do takeout. From inside. We don't have to be done if you don't want to be done." He blinked. And then, slowly, He smiled. Not the polite smile from earlier in the evening, not the managed expression of a man being careful. A real one. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." They sat on the low concrete wall along the waterfront with paper takeout containers and shared a second order of bread because the restaurant had included it by mistake and neither of them mentioned the mistake. The cold was sharp enough to make the food steam, and the water beyond them was dark and moving slowly. Vanessa had retrieved her blazer and Logan had given her his jacket on top of it, which she had objected to and then accepted. Mia had already been confirmed safe and settled, and Logan's phone was in his pocket, and the evening had taken on a different quality now. Not the careful formality of the restaurant, but something else, something unguarded and slightly strange, the way situations occasionally do after something real has happened in them. "Can I ask you something?" Vanessa said. "Sure." "When you looked up and saw me, in the restaurant, before we introduced ourselves," she kept her eyes on the water. "What did you think?" A pause. She gave him credit for the pause. It meant he was considering the honest answer rather than the flattering one. "I thought you looked like someone who'd come to the wrong meeting," he said finally. "Not in a bad way. I don't know. You were dressed like you were going somewhere more important than dinner with me." She looked at him. "That's a deflection," she said. He had the grace to look slightly caught. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She waited. "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought you were about to look at me and see a dock worker and decide this wasn't going to work. And I thought I wouldn't blame you." She was quiet for a moment. The water moved below them. "I thought," she said carefully, "that you were going to look at me and see someone who didn't look like what you were expecting, and calculate whether it was worth staying." He turned to look at her fully. "Did I seem like I was doing that?" For about half a second. "And then you stood up," she said, and shook my hand." He didn't say anything for a moment. A container ship's lights moved slowly across the bay. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "the thing I thought when you pulled Mia out of the street I wasn't calculating anything. I just thought—" He stopped. "I thought, that's someone." Vanessa looked at the water. Something in her chest was doing something she was going to pretend it wasn't doing. "Okay," she said. "Yeah." They ate in silence for a few minutes, not the silence of people who've run out of things to say. The other kind. "So," Logan said eventually, "you run the whole thing, the logistics company." "I do." "How does that work on a daily basis? What does that actually look like?" Nobody asked her that. People asked her about revenue, about market share, about the acquisition she'd made in Portland 2 years ago. They didn't ask what it actually looked like on a daily basis. She told him. The 6 a.m. freight status reports. The terminal managers who called her directly when something was going wrong because they'd learned she wanted to know immediately and not after it was solved. The contract negotiations that could stretch across 11 time zones. The way she still sometimes walked the actual dock at the Tacoma terminal on early mornings, just to feel the physical reality of it, because it was easy in her position to lose track of what was actually moving and become someone who only managed numbers. He listened the way people rarely listened, not waiting for his turn, actually listening. "Why logistics?" he asked when she paused. "Why specifically?" "You could have gone into anything with those skills." She looked at her hands. Her nails were done. She kept up appearances in the ways that mattered for business. But her hands were still her hands, strong and practical underneath the polish. "My first real job was data entry for a shipping broker in Bellingham. I was 19. I spent 8 months tracking container movements across 3 Pacific shipping lanes, and I understood it. The way things had to move to make other things possible. The dependency chains. I could see it all at once in my head." She paused. "That's not very exciting." "I think that is extremely exciting," he said, completely seriously. She laughed. It surprised her. "Okay, dock worker," she said. "Your turn. Why industrial maintenance?" "It wasn't a plan," he said. "It was a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time." He said it without irony, which somehow made it funnier than if he'd been joking. They talked for another hour on the concrete wall in the cold air with their empty takeout containers. At some point, Vanessa realized she had completely stopped thinking about how she looked, which was unusual. She was always thinking on some level about how she looked. It was a background process that had been running so long it had become invisible until its absence was noticeable. When she was with Logan Pierce, it went quiet. She didn't know what to do with that. He drove her to her car, which was in the parking structure 2 blocks from the restaurant. They sat for a moment in the idling truck, which was very warm on his side and very cold on her side, and she noted this discrepancy but didn't mention it. "I'd like to do this again," she said. Directly, because she was direct. It was the thing she was most confident about herself, her ability to say the thing plainly. He looked at her in the dim light of the parking structure. With or without the near catastrophe? Honestly, it's a very memorable first date. He smiled again, the real one. She was beginning to be able to tell them apart. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She got out and walked to her car, and she did not look back, because she was not going to be a person who looked back. And then she looked back and he was still watching from the truck. And neither of them did anything about it. They just acknowledged it, and she got in her car and sat in the dark for a moment before she started the engine. Outside, she could hear the port, the way it breathed at night, engines and water and the distant sound of metal on metal, the sound of things being moved from one place to another, the whole city's invisible machinery running under the surface of everything. She thought about what Logan had said. "I just thought, that's someone." She started the car and drove home through the Friday night streets of Seattle, and for the first time in a very long time, she was looking forward to a phone call that wasn't about work. So, 3 blocks away, Logan Pierce sat in his truck for a moment longer before pulling out of the parking structure. The heater was going full force on his side of the cab. The passenger side was cold and empty. He thought about Mia on the sidewalk, small and whole, and completely unbothered by the fact that she'd just scared him out of a year of his life. He thought about the look on Vanessa's face as she'd held his daughter's shoulders and asked if she was okay. The rawness of genuine fear, unmanaged, real. He thought about a woman in a burgundy dress kneeling on a cold sidewalk without thinking twice about her dress. He pulled out onto the street and drove home in the dark, and by the time he parked in front of his building, he had already made a decision he hadn't quite acknowledged yet. He was going to call her, and when he called, he was going to ask if she was free on Thursday. And he was going to take Mia this time, because Mia had apparently already made her own decision about Vanessa Hartwell. And Logan Pierce had learned a long time ago that when his daughter set her mind to something, the rest of the world generally caught up eventually. He went inside, paid Mrs. Delacroix's extra hour, checked on Mia, asleep, her hand tucked under her cheek the way it always was, and stood in her doorway in the dark for a moment, just watching her breathe. "The fat bird on the pole," he said softly. Mia did not stir. He went to bed. For the first time in longer than he could accurately count, he didn't lie awake going through the maintenance log in his head. He called her on Sunday. He told himself he would wait until Monday, that calling on Sunday would look like he'd been thinking about it all weekend, which he had been. But there was a difference between having done something and advertising that you'd done it. He lasted until about 2 in the afternoon, when Mia fell asleep on the couch with a picture book face down on her chest, and the apartment went quiet, and he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his phone in his hand, and finally just called. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "I was wondering when you'd do that," she said, and he could hear that she was outside somewhere. Wind, distant traffic, the particular acoustic quality of open space. "Where are you?" "Walking. I do that on Sundays when I can't sit still anymore." A pause. "Which is most Sundays." "I thought you had an 8 a.m. call on Saturdays." "I did, and then a follow-up at 11. Sunday's my attempt at a human being's schedule." He turned his coffee mug on the table. "How's that working?" "Poorly. I've checked my email 4 times since I left the building." He laughed, quiet so he wouldn't wake Mia. "Thursday," he said. "Are you free on Thursday evening?" A beat. "I can be. There's a place near the market, not fancy. They do fish and chips, and they're good at it, and that's the whole thing." "I like fish and chips." "Mia's coming," he said. He wanted to say it plainly, without apology, because it wasn't something he was apologizing for. "She's been asking about you since Friday. I figured it was either bring her or listen to another week of questions I can't answer." There was a silence that lasted long enough that he almost said something to fill it. Then Vanessa said, "What kind of questions?" "Is she nice? Does she like frogs? Why does her hair look like that?" That last one I couldn't answer. Another silence, shorter this time, and he thought he heard something in it that might have been a smile. "Thursday works," she said. "Text me the address." The fish and chips place was called Pier 9 Catch, and it had 8 tables, a counter where you ordered, and a chalkboard menu that had not changed appreciably in the 4 years since Logan had first started coming here with Mia in a stroller. The owner was a man named Gerald, who was 71 years old and had opinions about the correct ratio of batter to fish that he was willing to share at length with anyone who showed the faintest interest, and several people who didn't. Mia was already in a booth when Vanessa arrived, having arranged herself and her crayons across one full side of the table in a way that left Logan sitting across from empty space. She had done this deliberately, he was almost certain. He'd had to move her backpack to make room for himself, and she'd given him a look. Vanessa came through the door in jeans and a rust-colored top, no blazer, and the shift from how she'd looked at the restaurant was notable, not diminished. The opposite, actually. She looked like herself in a way that the restaurant version had only partially managed. Mia looked up from her coloring and pointed a green crayon. "Your hair is natural," she announced. "I figured it out." Vanessa stopped, looked at Logan. He offered nothing. "It is," Vanessa said carefully. "Mine is too, but Mrs. Delacroix puts things in it." Mia returned to coloring. "You can sit here." She relocated approximately 4 crayons to make 6 inches of space. "Thank you," Vanessa said, and sat down. Logan watched the two of them across the table. Mia continued coloring with the focused intensity she brought to everything creative, occasionally narrating decisions she was making. "This part is the ocean. That's not a mistake, that's a wave." And Vanessa watched with an expression Logan had seen on people around Mia before, but that looked different on her. Most adults watched Mia with a kind of polite performance of interest. Vanessa watched her the way you watch something that's actually interesting to you. "What are you drawing?" Vanessa asked. "A map." "Of where?" Mia considered. "Somewhere better." Vanessa's mouth twitched. She glanced at Logan. He shrugged in the way that meant, "This is every conversation." Gerald came to take their order and spent an additional 4 minutes explaining what he'd done differently with the batter this month, which Vanessa listened to with what appeared to be genuine attention, asking a follow-up question about oil temperature that sent Gerald into a visible state of appreciation. When he finally retreated to the kitchen, Logan looked at her. "You actually wanted to know about the oil temperature," he said. "Temperature affects texture. That's a supply chain logic problem in miniature." She picked up her water glass. "Also, he clearly loves talking about it." Mia looked up. "Gerald always talks about the fish," she said, with the authority of a regular. "Daddy says it's because the fish is the only thing he likes more than talking. Your father sounds wise." Mia considered Logan with a critical eye. "Sometimes," she allowed. The evening did not go smoothly, in the way that evenings with 5-year-olds do not go smoothly. Mia knocked over a cup of water. Not dramatically, just the specific combination of a wide gesture while explaining something about a cartoon rabbit and a cup that was too close to her elbow. The water went across the table and Vanessa moved her phone out of the way and Logan grabbed napkins and Mia looked briefly mortified before deciding it wasn't worth the emotional energy and returning to her map. "Sorry," Logan said. "It's a table," Vanessa said. "She does this. She's 5. My assistant knocked a full glass of sparkling water onto my laptop during a board prep meeting last quarter. Adults do it too." "Was the laptop okay?" "No." She said it completely flat. "It was a very bad afternoon." He laughed. She liked making him laugh. She was noticing that. Not performing for it. Not working toward it. Just noticing that when it happened, it had a quality of genuineness that was not something she encountered that often. After dinner, while Mia organized her crayons with the specific seriousness of someone conducting an inventory, Vanessa asked Logan about the crane incident. He'd mentioned it briefly on Friday, the kind of passing reference that invites a follow-up or doesn't, depending on the listener. She'd followed up. He told her the fuller version, the fraying he documented, the logs that had gone unanswered, the way Greer had tried to redirect the conversation toward his report rather than the underlying failure. She listened without interrupting, which was a skill, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What happened to the report?" she asked. "Filed it, documented everything. Greer's going to try to bury it." "And you're going to let him?" He looked at her. "I'm a maintenance tech. Greer's a site manager." "I know what you each are," she said. "That's not what I asked." He turned his beer glass. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm thinking about it." The cable housing failure is an OSHA reportable event if the crane was operational. "I know what it is." "Then you also know that Greer burying your maintenance logs is not just a management problem." "I know that too." She held his gaze. Not pushing. She knew the difference between pushing and pressing a point, but not backing off either. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do with your job. I'm just saying that you already know what the right thing is, and you're deciding whether the cost is worth it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're pretty direct," he said. "I'm told that regularly." I didn't say it like it was a problem. Something settled in her expression. "I know, I'm just used to hedging the response." Mia looked up from her crayons. "Daddy, can Vanessa come to my school show? It's on the 22nd. The table went entirely still. Logan opened his mouth, closed it. "Bug, it's on a Thursday," Mia said to Vanessa, as if this were a scheduling negotiation she'd prepared for. Vanessa looked at Logan with an expression that said clearly, "This is your call. I'm not stepping on it." He looked at Mia. "That's a long way from now. You can't just invite people without—" "You invited her to fish and chips," Mia said. There was a short silence. Gerald, somewhere in the kitchen, dropped something metal. "The 22nd, Vanessa said, looking at Mia. "What's the show about?" "Animals," Mia said. "I'm a penguin." "An important penguin?" "The most important penguin." "Then I'll see if I can move some things around," Vanessa said. She looked at Logan, and there was something careful in her expression, something that acknowledged the weight of what had just happened without making it into more than it was. "If that's okay." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's okay? What?" The weeks that followed had a quality to them that Logan hadn't experienced in so long, he'd almost forgotten it was possible. Not the weeks themselves, they were the same weeks, with the same early mornings and maintenance logs and Mia's nightly running commentary on everything she'd seen and thought and concluded during the day. But there was something different running underneath them, a frequency he'd stopped being able to hear and had recently picked back up. He and Vanessa texted most evenings. Not intensely, not the constant stream that characterized the early weeks of things when people were still performing interest rather than actually having it. Just whatever was happening. The OSHA report he'd filed against Greer's specific instructions, which Vanessa had responded to with a single line. "Good. Send me a copy if you want a second set of eyes." The new crane part that arrived 2 weeks late and the wrong size. The Saturday morning, Mia had announced she was going to learn to read French because Mrs. Delacroix said it was useful, and Logan had responded by Googling French children's books at 11 p.m., and somehow ending up reading a Wikipedia article about the history of the printing press. Vanessa sent him a photo one Tuesday evening of her desk at 9 p.m., every surface covered in documents with a coffee cup in the center, and a yellow sticky note that said in her own handwriting, "Human beings go home." He'd replied, "Do you?" She'd replied, "Working on it." He'd replied, "How?" She'd replied, "Someone keeps texting me pictures of French children's books." They had dinner twice more in the next 3 weeks. Once at a Thai place near his apartment that Mia had picked because she'd heard the word noodles. And once, on a Friday evening when Mia was at a birthday party, at a small Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill, where they'd sat for 3 hours and left only because the staff had begun the closing cleanup and they'd taken the hint. That was the night Vanessa told him about growing up in foster care. Not as a confession, not as an explanation for anything, just as a fact that came up naturally in a conversation about family and what you did with the version you hadn't been given. She'd been in 6 placements between the ages of 4 and 16. Some of them had been fine. One had been genuinely good, a woman named Marta in Olympia, who'd had 3 other foster children and a chaotic household and absolutely nothing extra to give anyone, but who had fed them all and kept them warm and occasionally managed something in the direction of warmth that wasn't performance. One placement had been bad in a way Vanessa described without detail, using the specific economy of language that meant the detail existed, and she'd decided not to give it. She'd aged out at 18 with $1,100, a community college acceptance letter, and a facility with numbers that she hadn't yet understood was unusual. She'd worked nights, transferred to a 4-year school on a scholarship she'd hunted down herself, built her way into the logistics industry from data entry up. The shelters, Logan said. He'd heard something. Danny had mentioned it obliquely, one of those comments that was meant to convey information without quite saying it. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. What about them? You fund them. Single-parent shelters. She turned her wine glass. I fund 3 of them, and 2 transitional housing programs for kids aging out of the foster system. She said it the way she said most things about herself that mattered, flatly, without emotional elaboration. It's not altruism, it's, I know what the specific problem feels like. It seems like a reasonable use of money. That's altruism, he said. It's targeted spending. Vanessa. She looked at him. He was looking at her steadily, not with pity or admiration exactly, just with the expression of someone who was seeing her clearly and deciding she should know it. Okay, she said. Maybe both. Usually both, he said, and she recognized the echo of what she'd said to him about Mia and her mother weeks ago on the waterfront, and she looked down at her glass. I don't talk about it publicly, she said. The shelters, the foster programs. My PR team knows I have charitable giving, but they don't push the specifics. Why? Because if it becomes a story, it becomes about me, and then it stops being about the people it's supposed to be about. He looked at her for a long moment. You're more complicated than you look, he said. So are you, she said. I'm a dock worker who reads French children's books at 11 p.m. You're a man who filed an OSHA report against his supervisor because it was the right thing to do, knowing exactly what it might cost him. She paused. That's not a simple person. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, Capitol Hill was doing what Capitol Hill did on Friday evenings. Loud, lit up, full of people moving between things. I like you, he said finally. Simple and direct, the way she'd taught him to be without meaning to. She met his eyes. I know, she said. I like you too. It was the first time either of them had said it plainly, without the buffer of humor or deflection, and it sat on the table between them like something physical. The server appeared to apologetically mention that they were closing. The first photograph appeared on a Friday, 5 weeks into whatever this was. Logan saw it because Mia's school show had generated a small local human interest piece in a Seattle neighborhood blog. Nothing major, just a few hundred words about a fundraiser the school was running, with a photo of some of the families attending. He was in the photo. So was Mia. So was Vanessa, who'd rearranged a conference call and arrived 10 minutes before the show started and sat between Logan and a father named Marcus, who talked too much, and she'd watched Mia's penguin performance with the focused attention she gave to things she was actually invested in. The blog post was nothing. 40 people read it, maybe 60. But someone in the comments recognized Vanessa Hartwell and said so, and the comment got screenshotted, and that screenshot ended up on a financial gossip account with 40,000 followers, with a caption that said CEO of Hartwell Maritime, apparently doing the single dad thing. Interesting company choice. It went from there the way these things go from there. Logan found out about it because his coworker sent him a link on Monday morning with a string of question marks. He looked at his phone in the break room and read through enough of the comments to understand what was happening, and then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to work and spent the rest of the day doing what he usually did when something felt like it was sliding in a direction he couldn't control. He put his head down and moved through the immediate tasks in front of him. He told Vanessa that evening. She already knew. Priya flagged it Sunday, she said. She was on her phone, in what he'd come to recognize as the tone she used when she was managing something. It's not significant yet. Yet. It has the shape of something that could get traction. I've seen it before. Not this situation, but the pattern. A pause. Logan, I want to be clear about something. This isn't your problem to manage. My public profile is my business. It's got my name in it. Loosely. Nobody knows who you are. You're described as a single father. There's a partial photo. Vanessa. I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying don't panic about it yet. He wasn't panicking. He was doing something quieter and more specific than panicking. He was calculating. He was doing the math the way he did the maintenance log math, tracing the dependency chain. If this becomes a story, what does it cost her? What kind of cost? The investors who backed a logistics company didn't necessarily expect their CEO to be dating in a way that attracted tabloid-adjacent attention. He knew enough about how money worked, from watching Vanessa and from years of watching how port contracts moved, to understand that image was a currency in her world in a very real and specific way. How are your investors responding? He asked. A beat. Slightly too long. I've had 2 conversations today that touched on it. About us. About optics. It's early. What did you say? I said my personal life is my personal life and my company's performance speaks for itself. Her voice was steady, but he could hear something underneath it that had been tightened down. Which it does. We had our best quarter in 4 years. That's not what they're asking about. No, she agreed. It's not. He stared at the kitchen wall. Mia was doing something in her room involving what sounded like every stuffed animal she owned being relocated. I hate this, he said. I know. You shouldn't have to. I don't want you to have to defend... Logan, her voice was quiet and firm. Stop. I have spent 12 years defending every decision I've ever made to people who thought they had a stake in how I ran my own life. I'm not stopping now. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. After they hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The math in his head didn't stop when the phone did. The next 3 weeks had the feeling of weather changing. Nothing dramatic all at once, just the atmospheric pressure shifting incrementally until the air smelled different. The online coverage grew. Not massively. They weren't celebrities, this wasn't a movie star situation, but the specific and vicious quality of social media attention had its own logic, and once it found a shape it liked, it followed that shape with the precision of water finding a crack. The shape it found was the one that had always been easiest. She was rich and fat, he was working class and reasonably attractive, and the only legible explanation that the internet seemed capable of generating was that he was after something and she was foolish enough to give it to him. Logan had been called things before. He was a man in his mid-30s. He'd had years in enough difficult situations to develop a reasonably thick skin about most categories of criticism. But there was something different about watching it happen to Vanessa. Watching the comments stack up on posts that had her photo, the specific cruelty that got pointed at her body in language he wasn't going to repeat. The way the business press framed the same story in slightly more respectable language that amounted to the same question. Is this woman making poor decisions? He saw it because Mia accidentally picked up his phone one evening, trying to take a photo of her penguin costume for posterity, and navigated to his notifications before he could take the phone back. She didn't understand most of what she saw. She understood some of it. She handed the phone back to him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, uncertain, a little scared, the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world contains something they didn't know about. Are people being mean about Vanessa? She asked. He put the phone in his pocket. Some people are being stupid, he said. That's different from mean. It looked like mean. Yeah, he said. It did. He made her a snack and they sat on the couch and watched 40 minutes of the cartoon rabbit, and Mia fell asleep with her head on his arm, and Logan sat in the dark and thought about the math and hated every answer he was arriving at. He met Vanessa for coffee on a Wednesday, her building, the coffee place on the ground floor, at 7 a.m., because that was the slot that existed in her schedule. He'd come from an early shift changeover. He was still in his work clothes, and he was aware of that, and he was aware of how they looked sitting across from each other in the bright minimalist space of the coffee shop in her building's lobby, him in Carhartt, and her in a suit that had probably cost more than his truck. She looked tired. Not devastated, not broken. She wasn't that kind of person. She didn't do devastated as a public state. But the particular tiredness of someone who had been running hard and sleeping badly. My board is meeting on Friday, she said. She said it like she was giving him information, not a crisis alert. About you? About the company's image strategy, which is about me but framed as the company. She wrapped both hands around her coffee. There's a faction. I know who they are. They've been waiting for a reason, and this has given them something to organize around. What are they going to do? Try to push me toward a voluntary step back. Make it look like my choice. What happens if you say no? They don't have the votes to force anything. Yet. She looked at him. One of my largest investors called me yesterday. He was very polite about it, very measured. He said he thought I should consider how the current narrative was affecting stakeholder confidence. And you said? I said stakeholder confidence was built on 16 quarters of above-market returns, and I'd be happy to discuss those numbers in detail. A pause. He didn't call back. Logan looked at his coffee. He'd barely touched it. Someone's driving this, he said. The online stuff. It didn't grow the way organic attention grows. She held still. You know that, he said. I have suspicions. The smear campaign, someone's running it. I have a name, she said quietly. I don't have proof yet. Richard Connolly. He runs Meridian Pacific Freight. He's been trying to acquire 2 of my terminal contracts for 3 years. Every time I've blocked him. If he can destabilize my board position, those contracts become negotiable. Logan looked at her. What does your legal team say? They say it's possible, but we'd need digital evidence of coordination, which takes time to find or doesn't exist in findable form. She was very controlled when she talked about it, the way she was controlled about most things that were genuinely costing her. I'm handling it. I know you are. She looked at him. But? No but. He held her gaze. I just want you to know that I know what this is costing you, and I know that's partly because of me. It's not because of you. Vanessa. It's because someone is using you as a tool to get to me. That's different from you being the cause. Her voice had the quality of someone who needed him to understand the distinction. You didn't do anything wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. He knew that. He also knew that knowing it and feeling the weight of it were not the same operation. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she looked down at their hands on the table in the bright lobby coffee shop, his scarred and work-darkened, hers with the careful nails, and she turned her hand over so their palms were together. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly. It wasn't entirely clear which of them she was saying it to. I know, he said. He did know, he did. But the math in his head had been running for 3 weeks now, and it was arriving at a number he didn't want to look at, and he was beginning to understand that there was a difference between knowing something and being able to carry it. The board met on Friday without telling her what they'd decided until Monday. That was the first sign. In 12 years of running Hartwell Maritime Logistics, Vanessa had never been kept waiting on a board outcome by more than a few hours. The fact that Marcus Webb, the chairman, a man she'd personally recruited 7 years ago when she'd needed someone with institutional credibility to balance her youth, didn't call until Monday morning told her everything she needed to know about how the weekend had gone. She was already at her desk when the call came in. 7:43 a.m. She'd been there since 6. Vanessa. Webb's voice had the quality it got when he was delivering something he'd rehearsed, measured, slightly too careful. I want to have a conversation before you hear anything through other channels. Then talk, she said. A pause. The board took a preliminary vote on Friday regarding executive leadership structure. A preliminary vote. It wasn't binding. Nothing has been decided in any formal. Marcus, she kept her voice flat. What was the vote? Another pause. Longer. 7-4 in favor of exploring a transitional leadership arrangement. The language used was interim CEO structure pending image stabilization. He said the phrase with the specific discomfort of a man who knew how it sounded and had decided not to own it. I want to be clear that I voted against. 7-4, she said. The resolution isn't binding. It's exploratory. They'd need a formal. Who called the vote? She asked. Because you're the chairman and I know you didn't. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to be an answer. Hargrove and Chen filed a joint motion, Webb said finally. They cited fiduciary responsibility. Diane Hargrove and Kevin Chen. She knew both of them well enough to know they hadn't arrived at this independently. Hargrove had been circling Connolly's orbit for 2 years. She'd seen them at the same industry dinners, watched the specific dynamics of people who were deciding whether they were on the same team. Chen was more surprising, but Chen had money in 2 Meridian Pacific ventures that he'd never fully disclosed, which she knew and had chosen to manage quietly rather than escalate. That had apparently been a miscalculation. "I see," she said. "Vanessa, if you were to make a public statement, something measured that addressed the narrative directly, what kind of statement? Something that reassured investors, that contextualized the personal situation in terms of your commitment to the company." She was very quiet for a moment. Through the glass wall of her office, she could see Priya at her desk, not pretending to be busy with anything else, just sitting there with the expression of someone who was waiting to find out how bad the news was. "You're asking me to apologize," Vanessa said. "I'm asking you to manage the perception for having a relationship, for allowing a personal situation to create a distraction at a—" "I'm going to stop you there, Marcus." Her voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when she was genuinely angry, as opposed to the managed anger she used in negotiations. "I have built this company from 11 employees and a leased terminal space into a $500 million operation. I have done that through 3 recessions, 2 port strikes, and 1 global shipping crisis that nearly took out 4 of our competitors. The idea that a board I assembled is taking preliminary votes on my leadership because someone I'm seeing generates unkind comments on the internet is—" She stopped. "Let the air settle. I'll call you back, Marcus." She ended the call and sat for a moment, very still, with her hands flat on the desk. Then she opened her door. "Priya," she said, "get me everything we have on Connolly's digital footprint in the last 90 days. PR mentions, social media timing patterns, anything that touched the Hartwell narrative. I want it on my desk by noon." Priya was already writing. "Done. Anything else?" "Get me Thomas Breck, her head of security. Former digital forensics, she'd hired him 3 years ago, specifically because she'd understood that information was infrastructure. Tell him I need a conversation today." She didn't tell Logan about the vote that day. She told herself it was because she didn't have the full picture yet, which was true. She told herself it was because she needed to think clearly before she talked about it, which was also true. She did not tell herself the third reason, which was that she was afraid of what his face would do when he heard it, and more specifically afraid of the decision she could see building behind his eyes every time the subject of Connolly and the board and the investors came up. She'd seen it. She wasn't naive about it. Logan Pierce was a man who managed risk by taking it onto himself. She'd watched him absorb the dock supervisor situation, watch the OSHA report fall out, move through every difficult thing by calculating what he could carry and picking it up. It was part of what she respected about him. It was also the thing that scared her most in this specific situation, because she knew where that calculus was going and she didn't know how to interrupt it without making it worse. She called him on Wednesday. She told him there had been some board movement and that she was handling it. She kept her voice measured and gave him the shape of it without the specific numbers, and he was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was listening carefully, and she knew she wasn't getting away with it. 7-4, he said. She blinked. "How did you—" "I know how boards work when they're moving against someone. I've watched it happen in union situations more times than I can count. The preliminary vote is a message. They're telling you to act before they're forced to." A pause. 7-4 means they almost had it. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Vanessa." "Yes," she said. 7-4. The silence on his end had a weight to it. She could hear him thinking. "I'm building a case," she said. Breck's team found the first connection point between Connolly and 2 of the accounts that started the original social media push. "It's thin, but it's something. I need 2 more weeks, maybe 3, while the board continues moving. While I work the problem," she said firmly. "Logan, I know how to do this. I have spent 12 years navigating rooms full of people who thought they could move me if they applied the right pressure. I'm still here." "I know that," he said. "I know you can handle it." "Then let me." Another silence. "Okay," he said, but it wasn't okay. She could hear the difference. He called Danny that Thursday, which was not something he did without reason. Danny could tell the difference between a call that was checking in and a call that was working something out, and by the second sentence he'd made the appropriate gear shift and was listening instead of talking, which was significant effort for him. Logan walked the perimeter of the parking lot outside the port's south terminal on his lunch break, phone against his ear, and said the things he'd been not saying for 2 weeks. "She's going to lose the company," he said. "Not tomorrow. Maybe not even this year, but the board's already moving, the investors are nervous, and Connolly's not stopping. He's got everything to gain by keeping the pressure on, and none of it stops as long as I'm in the picture." "You don't know that," Danny said. "I know how it works. You remove the thing that's being used as a lever, you remove the lever." He stopped walking. The water was gray today, choppy, the kind of February cold that came in off the sound and went straight through. "She spent 12 years building that company. She grew up in the foster system, Danny. She built it from nothing. I'm not going to be the reason she loses it." "She doesn't see it that way." "I know she doesn't." "Then maybe she gets to decide." "She decides everything with her head," Logan said. "That's what makes her good at what she does, but right now her head and her—" He stopped. "She's not calculating this one right because she doesn't want to." Danny was quiet for a moment. "And you are? Calculating it?" "I'm trying to." "That's the problem, man." Danny's voice had lost the careful quality. "You're doing the dock thing. You found the broken cable and now you're calculating the damage radius. But this isn't a crane. You can't just fix it by removing yourself from the system." "You don't know that." "Neither do you." A pause. "Does she know you're thinking about this?" Logan didn't answer, which was an answer. "Logan, I'm not going to have a conversation with her where she talks me out of it," he said, "because she will. She's better at this than I am. She'll make 3 arguments I can't counter and I'll convince myself she's right because I want to be convinced. And then nothing changes and the board keeps moving and in 6 months she's out of the company she built." "Or," Danny said, "you could trust that she's a grown woman who runs a $500 million company and maybe knows more about managing her own situation than you do." "I trust her completely," Logan said. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He stood in the parking lot with the cold coming off the water and said the true thing, the one he'd been not saying even to himself. "I can't watch it happen. I can't stand there and watch someone He stopped, started again. "I can't be the thing that costs her what she built. I don't know how to do that and still be a person." Danny didn't say anything for a long moment. "You love her," Danny said finally. Not a question. Logan didn't answer. He turned back toward the terminal building. "Yeah," Danny said quietly. "That's what I thought. But..." He ended it on a Saturday. Mia was at a birthday party for a preschool friend, delivered and settled, pickup scheduled for 4. That gave him a window. He didn't plan it for the window specifically, or maybe he did, in the way that people arrange logistics around things they don't want to examine too closely. He drove to Vanessa's building and texted from the lobby. She came down instead of buzzing him up, which meant she already knew something was different because he always came up. She was in weekend clothes. Jeans, a gray sweater, hair down in the way it only was when she wasn't expecting to be seen professionally. And she looked at him the moment the elevator opened, and he watched her face do the thing it did when she was processing information she hadn't wanted to receive. They walked to the small plaza outside the building. It was cold. Neither of them had coats. The detail would stay with him afterward, the specific stupidity of standing in a February plaza without coats because neither of them had thought about it, because they were both too focused on the conversation they were walking toward. "Say it," she said. "Vanessa, don't do the preamble. You came here to say something specific. Say it." He looked at her. She was standing very straight, the way she stood when she was holding something in place. "I think we should stop," he said. She was quiet. The plaza had a fountain that wasn't running in winter, dry concrete in the center, pigeons moving around the edge of it. "Because of the board," she said. "Because of all of it. The board, Connolly, the investors, all of it." He kept his voice level. He'd decided to be clear and not perform this, not make it more complicated than it needed to be. "You're 2 weeks from having the evidence to move against Connolly. If I'm not in the picture, the primary narrative goes away. The board loses the excuse they're using, Hargrove and Chen don't have a motion to build on. That's a theory, she said. It's a reasonable one. It's not your decision to make. It's partially my decision, he said. It involves me. So we make it together. Her voice had an edge that he recognized. Not anger exactly, but the sound of someone fighting to stay controlled. That's how this works, Logan. You don't get to calculate this one by yourself and hand me the result. If I talk to you about it, you'll convince me not to, he said. You're better at this than I am. You'll make it sound like I'm wrong, and I'll want to believe you. Maybe you are wrong. Maybe. He held her gaze. But I've done the math 6 different ways, and I keep landing in the same place. You spent 12 years building something. Your board is moving against you. The fuel for that fire is us. He stopped. I'm not willing to watch you lose the company. I can't. It's not yours to... She stopped, started again. You're doing this because you think you're protecting me. I'm doing this because I know what that company means to you, what you gave to build it. He paused. You grew up with nothing. You made something real. I know what that is. I know what that costs. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't fully name. Not softness, not in this moment, but something that understood the specific weight of what he'd just said. And you think ending this protects it, she said. I think it gives you a chance. Without me in the frame, the narrative changes. Connolly loses his lever with the board. You take the evidence you're building and you go to the shareholder table from a cleaner position. He made himself look at her directly. That's the calculation. And us, she said. What's the calculation on us? He didn't answer right away. Logan, there isn't one that works, he said quietly. Not right now. Not while this is what it is. She turned away from him, stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the dry fountain. He could see the line of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself completely still. He wanted to say something else. He had more words. They were all there. He could feel them. He did not say them because he did not trust what they would do to his decision if he let them out. This is a mistake, she said, still with her back to him. Her voice was level and controlled, and he knew her well enough now to know that was the effort it took. You're making a decision about my life and my company that you don't have the full information to make. And you're doing it alone because you don't trust yourself to do it with me. Yes, he said. That's accurate. She turned around. Her face was composed in the way faces are composed when the alternative is worse. I want you to know, she said carefully, that this is not a decision I agree with. And it's not a decision I'm going to pretend to accept because it's neater for you. I know. And when you finished being noble about this, the word had a small, precise edge, I would appreciate it if you didn't act surprised by what's still there. He looked at her. He didn't know what his face was doing. He had a feeling it was doing more than he intended. I won't, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she went back inside. He stood in the plaza for a while after the lobby doors closed. The pigeons moved around the fountain. A delivery truck went past on the street. The cold was very specific now that he noticed it. The kind that meant it was going to rain before evening. He got in his truck and drove to pick up Mia. She did not call Priya when she got back to her apartment. She did not call Webb or Breck or anyone on her legal team. She sat on her couch with her phone face down on the cushion beside her and did not do anything useful for 47 minutes, which was longer than she had done nothing useful in a single stretch since she could remember. She was angry. That was the cleanest part of it. The anger was clean and she understood it, and it had a shape she could hold. He'd taken a unilateral decision about both their lives and dressed it up as sacrifice, and whether or not his math was right about the board and Connolly, the act itself was the act of someone who didn't trust her to handle the full weight of things alongside him. She knew he didn't mean it that way. That almost made it worse. The other part was not clean. She picked up her phone eventually and called no one, and instead sat looking at the contact she didn't call. The one labeled with just his first name, and understood with the specific clarity that came after the feeling had finished moving through her what the actual problem was. She'd let herself believe it. That was the thing she hadn't meant to do and had done anyway. She had spent a very long time being careful about what she let matter, careful about what she let close. careful about the specific distance you maintained when you were someone who'd been left enough times to understand that the math usually came out that way eventually. And then a dock worker with paint on his collar and a 5-year-old with opinions about frogs had quietly gotten inside that perimeter without her noticing until it was too late to care about the perimeter. And now he'd made the exact choice she'd spent years protecting herself from expecting. And the worst part was she understood why. And the worst part of the worst part was that she loved him for the reason he'd done it, even as she hated the thing itself. She put her phone down. She had a board to dismantle and a corrupt executive to expose and a company to keep. And those were all problems she knew how to move through, and she was going to move through them. But the apartment was very quiet. The rain came in exactly when Logan had known it would. As he drove back from the birthday party with Mia buckled in the back asking him detailed questions about the cake. What flavor? How many tiers? Why was there a dinosaur on it even though it was Caden's birthday, and Caden didn't know that much about dinosaurs? He answered each question with the portion of his attention he had available and kept the rest on the road. He carried Mia inside when she fell asleep against the window, which she sometimes did in the last 10 minutes of a drive, her body making the specific calculation that rest was more valuable than being ambulatory. He put her on the couch and covered her with the blanket from the back of the armchair and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his phone. No messages. He hadn't expected any. He put the phone in his pocket. The apartment had the particular quality it sometimes had on weekend evenings when Mia was asleep and the outside world had gone quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but settled. His own. He'd built this specific ordinary life out of difficult circumstances, and it was not glamorous, and it was not what he'd imagined when he was younger, but it was real, and it was his. And Mia was asleep on the couch with her face tucked against the cushion, making small sounds of absolute uncomplicated rest. He had done the right thing. He was almost certain of it. He made coffee he didn't want and sat with it at the table in the quiet, and thought about a woman in a burgundy dress kneeling on a cold sidewalk without thinking twice, and a rust-colored top on a Thursday, and the way she'd said "I know" when he'd told her he liked her, and the weight of what she'd said in the plaza today with her back to him, voice completely controlled over something that was not under control at all. When you finished being noble about this, I would appreciate it if you didn't act surprised by what's still there. He sat in the quiet kitchen with his cold coffee. He had done the right thing. He told himself that. He told himself that until Mia woke up and came looking for him and climbed into his lap with her hair a mess and her eyes still soft from sleep. And he held her and told himself that. He mostly believed it. Vanessa's team found the second connection point on a Tuesday, 9 days after the plaza. Thomas Breck put the file in front of her at 8 a.m. Digital records showing that 2 of the accounts that had seeded the original social media narrative were registered to Shell email addresses that traced back to a marketing consulting firm with 3 active contracts, one of which was with a holding company 2 steps removed from Meridian Pacific Freight. It was not a smoking gun. It was the kind of evidence that became a smoking gun in the hands of the right people, once you had the thread and could pull it. She looked at the file for a long time. "How solid is the chain?" she asked Breck. Solid enough to raise the question formally, not solid enough to survive a well-funded legal challenge on its own. He'd been doing this long enough to know the difference. We need the marketing firm's internal communications. That means either a voluntary disclosure or a subpoena, which means legal action, which means making this public, he said, or at minimum, making it known to the board that you have this and are prepared to make it public. She sat back in her chair and looked at the file. She thought about what Logan had said. 2 weeks from having the evidence. He'd been close. He'd been doing the math from the outside, and he'd been close. She thought about the board meeting she knew was coming. Webb had called her on Friday to tell her that Hargrove had formally scheduled a full board session for the following week. Not a preliminary motion this time. A formal agenda item on leadership structure. She had 11 days. She picked up the file and stood up. "Get me Breck's full documentation and 3 legal opinions by end of today," she told Priya. "And schedule a call with Marcus Webb. Don't give him a subject line. Just say I need 30 minutes. She walked back into her office and looked out at the water, at the shipping lanes and the terminal lights, and the whole machinery of the industry she'd built her life inside. Somewhere on that port, a man she wasn't with anymore was going to work in the cold and doing the math he thought was keeping her safe. She picked up the file and started reading. She had 11 days, and she was not done yet. and she had never in her adult life needed anyone to sacrifice something for her to survive, and she was not going to start now. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. Vanessa found it on her desk when she came back from a lunch meeting she'd barely eaten at, a stack of documents on one side, her afternoon briefing notes on the other, and in the center a small envelope with no return address that Priya had placed there with a post-it that said, "Mailed to the building." Your name on it, personal, not company. The handwriting on the envelope was a child's, large uneven letters that had been pressed hard into the paper, the kind of writing that happened when someone was concentrating very seriously on every single stroke. She stood at her desk and looked at it for a moment before she sat down and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice, drawn in crayon. The colors were specific: blue for the sky, green for what might have been grass or might have been the ocean. It was ambiguous in the way that children's geography often is. And in the center, 3 figures drawn in the simple shorthand of a 5-year-old's understanding of people. The tallest one on the left had dark marks on its hands that were probably supposed to be grease or work gloves. The round one in the middle was clearly the largest of the 3, with curly hair that had been given significant crayon attention. The smallest one on the right had a penguin costume, or possibly just a very structured outfit. It was unclear. Above the 3 figures in the same pressed, careful handwriting as the envelope were 4 words. Families don't quit. No apostrophe. 5 years old. Vanessa sat at her desk with the drawing in her hands for a long time, longer than 47 minutes this time. Priya came to the glass wall twice, looked in, and walked away without knocking. She was not a person who cried at her desk. She had a strong general policy against it, built across 12 years of being a woman in rooms where showing any form of emotion was immediately converted into evidence of instability. The policy held. Barely. She set the drawing carefully to the side, away from the coffee cup, and sat very straight in her chair and looked out at the water. The shipping lanes were busy today. A Hartwell container ship was moving south toward the Tacoma terminal, loaded and slow and steady in the gray water. She'd been on that ship twice during her first year running the company, when she'd still been physically walking every part of the operation to understand it in her body, and not just on paper. She turned back to her desk and opened her laptop. She had 11 days. Now she had something she hadn't had before the envelope arrived. She had stopped being willing to lose. Marcus Webb did not expect her to come to his office. That much was clear from his expression when she walked in at 8:15 the following morning. His assistant had called ahead professionally with exactly enough notice to be courteous and not enough to allow full preparation. Webb was a careful man who liked prepared surfaces, and Vanessa had learned years ago that the way to have an honest conversation with a careful man was to catch him before he'd finished arranging his face. She sat down across from him and put Thomas Breck's documentation on his desk. "The marketing firm is called Sandor Group," she said. "They have 3 active clients. One of them is a holding company called Cascadia Asset Partners, which is the financial vehicle Richard Connolly uses for acquisitions that he doesn't want attached to the Meridian Pacific name. The connection from Sandor Group to Connolly runs through 2 layers, both of which are documented in what I just gave you." Webb looked at the file without touching it. "Vanessa, the accounts that seeded the original social media narrative, the ones that started the CEO makes poor personal decisions story, were registered through Sandor Group's digital infrastructure. We have the IP mapping. Our legal team has reviewed it and says it constitutes sufficient grounds for a tortious interference claim." She paused. "What it also constitutes is grounds for you to understand that the board's current motion is built on fabricated context." Webb picked up the file. He read slowly, which meant he was reading carefully, which was the right instinct. She waited. "This isn't complete," he said finally. "You'd need the internal communications from Sandor Group to establish intent." "I know. I have a subpoena application being reviewed by outside counsel today." She kept her voice even. "What I'm giving you right now is enough to establish that a competitor with direct financial interests in my removal was involved in creating the conditions that led to this board motion. That's the conversation I need you to have with Hargrove and Chen before the formal session." Webb set the file down. He was a man who had been in enough rooms to know when something had shifted, and she could see him recalibrating. "Diane Hargrove is not going to back down easily," he said. I know. She's built a coalition. 4 of the 7 who voted preliminary are genuinely concerned about the company's direction, not just doing Connolly's bidding. They need a different reason to change position, not just evidence of manipulation. Then I'll give them one, Vanessa said. Schedule the formal session. Don't push it back. I want it on the calendar. Webb looked at her. You're not asking me to delay. No. You're asking to go into a room where 7 people may vote to remove you, with evidence that's incomplete, and make your case. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Why? She thought about the drawing on her desk, the 3 figures in crayon, the pressed, careful handwriting of a 5-year-old who hadn't learned yet that quitting was sometimes supposed to be the reasonable option. Because waiting is the same as retreating, she said. And I'm done retreating. Webb nodded slowly. Something in his expression, not quite respect, he'd always respected her, shifted into something more specific. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who understood that the person across from them had arrived at a decision that wasn't coming undone. I'll call Hargrove today, he said. Thank you, Marcus. She stood up and left his office, and in the elevator on the way down, she let herself feel the fear for approximately 30 seconds. The specific fear of someone who has set something in motion that cannot be stopped and may land badly. And then she put it away and took out her phone and called Breck. Logan found out about the shareholder meeting the same way the rest of Seattle found out. A brief item in the business press that appeared on a Tuesday morning, noting that Hartwell Maritime Logistics would hold an emergency shareholder session on Thursday to address questions about executive leadership structure. The item was 3 sentences. It used the phrase ongoing questions about the CEO's focus and cited unnamed investor sources, which meant either that Connolly's people were still leaking or that the business press had developed an independent appetite for the story. He read it on his phone in the break room at the port, standing in the same corner where he'd read about the initial photograph 5 weeks ago, and the feeling he had was not the same one. That one had been the early feeling, the measured risk feeling, the feeling of someone watching a situation develop and calculating options. This feeling was different, simpler and worse. He put his phone away and went back to work. He made it until noon. He was replacing a hydraulic seal on a piece of loading equipment in the south terminal when the specific thought arrived that he hadn't been able to put a name to all morning. It arrived clearly and without preamble, the way true thoughts sometimes did when you'd been avoiding them long enough. He had made a decision that he'd told himself was about protecting her, and it might have been, but it was also about not being able to stand there and bear the weight of what he felt without the option of acting on it. He had turned a feeling he couldn't manage into a calculation he could, and he'd called it sacrifice, and Vanessa had called it noble with that precise small edge, and she had been more right than he'd been willing to hear. He sat on the dock with a hydraulic seal in his hand and thought about that for a while. Danny had said, "You can't fix it by removing yourself from the system." He'd said he wasn't a crane, and Logan had thought at the time that Danny was wrong, that this was exactly the kind of situation where you identified the point of failure and addressed it. But the thing about a crane was that the cable and the crane were not the same object. You could replace the cable and the crane remained. What he'd done was more like deciding the crane itself was the problem and walking away from the dock and waiting for the load to sort itself out. He reassembled the hydraulic connection and stood up and pulled out his phone. He did not call Vanessa. That was not a call he had standing to make in this moment. Not with the shareholder meeting 48 hours out and Vanessa in the middle of the most consequential 2 days of her professional life. He was clear enough about what he'd done wrong to know that inserting himself into that moment would be the same mistake wearing different clothes. Still about what he needed rather than what she did. He called Danny instead. "I need to know when the Brightfield Foundation fundraiser is," he said. Vanessa had mentioned it once, the annual event for single-parent families that she personally organized, the one that was connected to the shelter network she funded. He hadn't retained the date. A pause. Why? Because I need to know. Another pause. He could hear Danny deciding something. Second weekend in March, Saturday. It's at the community center on Eastlake. A longer pause. Logan? Yeah. Are you sure about this? He looked out at the water. A Hartwell ship was in the lane, moving steady and loaded and slow. "Ask me again after Thursday," he said. The shareholder meeting was held at Hartwell Maritime's headquarters in the top-floor conference room that Vanessa had built specifically for this kind of event. Long table, clean sightlines, windows that looked out over the water on three sides, because she'd believed from the beginning that the people making decisions about this company should always be able to see what they were deciding about. She had not slept well. She was not going to tell anyone that. She wore charcoal gray. Not her most striking outfit, but the one that had never failed her in rooms like this. The one that said, "I have been here before and I am still here." She had Priya's briefing notes memorized. She had Breck's documentation organized in order of impact, building from the circumstantial to the concrete. She had 3 years of financial performance data that she could navigate without notes because she'd lived inside those numbers. She had a crayon drawing in her desk drawer that she had looked at before she came upstairs. The shareholders filed in. 12 voting members, 4 observers. Webb at the head of the table. Hargrove and Chen across from Vanessa, which was exactly where they'd positioned themselves for the preliminary vote, and which she found clarifying rather than threatening. She always preferred to know where the pressure was coming from. 2 of the 7 who'd voted preliminary were sitting closer to Webb's end of the table than they had been at the last session, which was information. Webb opened the meeting with procedural language that Vanessa listened to with half her attention and used the other half to read the room. Body language. Where people's eyes went, who looked at Hargrove before speaking, who didn't. Hargrove opened the substantive conversation before Webb finished the procedural framing, which was a power move and a slightly impatient one. "I think we're all aware of why we're here," she said. She had the voice of someone who had decided this was already settled and was performing the process as a courtesy. "The leadership question has been building since January. The preliminary vote indicated the direction of the board's thinking. This session is an opportunity to formalize. Before we do that," Vanessa said, "I'd like the board to review some documentation that came to my team's attention last week." She slid the Breck file to Webb, who passed copies down both sides of the table. "What is this?" Chen asked. "Documentation connecting the social media campaign that created the narrative currently being used to question my leadership to a marketing firm called Sandor Group, which has financial ties to Cascadia Asset Partners." She let that sit for a beat. "Which is Richard Connolly's acquisition vehicle." The room changed. Not dramatically. These were people trained to manage their reactions, but it changed. 2 of the 7 looked at each other quickly. One of the others looked down at the file without the expression of someone reading new information, which was its own kind of information. Hargrove's face stayed composed. "This is interesting, but it doesn't—" "Connolly has been attempting to acquire the Tacoma and Bellingham terminal contracts for 3 years, Vanessa said. "Every attempt has been blocked at my direction. If this board removes me, those contracts become available for renegotiation under new leadership. The financial incentive for Connolly to engineer this situation is specific and documentable." She looked directly at Hargrove. "I'm not saying every person in this room understood that when they supported the preliminary motion. I'm saying someone did. The silence was the specific quality of silence that happened when something true had been said in a room and everyone was deciding individually whether to acknowledge it. Chen spoke first, which surprised her. "How solid is the chain from Sandor Group to Connolly's holding company?" 2 layers of corporate structure, both documented. Our legal team has filed a subpoena application for Sandor Group's internal communications. We expect compliance within 10 days. Chen looked at the file. He had the expression of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "If that subpoena produces what you're expecting, it will change the character of this conversation significantly," Vanessa said. "I would rather have that conversation now, with this board, than have it in a courtroom 6 months from now." One of the 7, a man named Aldrich, who had voted preliminary but who she'd always believed was genuinely rather than strategically concerned, leaned forward. "Let's talk about the performance numbers," he said. "Because if we're reconsidering the framing of this motion, I want to understand what we're actually protecting." That was the opening. She gave them the numbers. Not defensively. She didn't have to be defensive about these numbers, and defensiveness would have been the wrong register anyway. She gave them the way she gave everything she was certain of, cleanly and with detail, quarter by quarter, the specific decisions that had driven growth during the shipping crisis, The terminal expansion that had added 18% capacity without proportional cost increase. The forward contracts that had locked in favorable rates before the Pacific Lane disruptions last fall. She gave them what 12 years of work looked like when it was laid out on a table without apology. She did not apologize for having a personal life. She had decided, somewhere between Mia's drawing and this morning's mirror, that she was not going to do that. Hargrove made 2 more attempts to redirect the conversation toward image management. Both times Vanessa answered the question underneath the question, which was, "Do you have the support of this room or not?" By the 3rd hour, the shape of the answer was becoming clear enough that Hargrove stopped trying to reframe it. The formal vote was 7-5 in Vanessa's favor, which was not a comfortable margin and was not a complete victory, but was enough. The leadership motion failed. The Connolly documentation was referred to the board's legal subcommittee for review. Chen abstained, which was a form of public positioning that she noted and filed away. Hargrove left without speaking to her. She had expected that. Webb caught her arm briefly as the room cleared. "That was the best performance I've seen in a boardroom in 20 years, he said quietly. "It wasn't a performance," she said. He smiled, just slightly. "I know. That's why it worked." Time. She went back to her office and sat down and felt the specific exhaustion of 3 weeks of sustained pressure releasing all at once, which was not pleasant. It felt less like relief and more like what happened when you'd been braced for something for so long that the unbracing itself was a physical event. She sat at her desk with her eyes closed for approximately 4 minutes, which was the most she could afford. Then she opened her desk drawer and looked at Mia's drawing. Families don't quit. She thought about Logan. She thought about him the way she'd been not thinking about him for 3 weeks, which meant she thought about all of it at once and let herself feel the full weight of it without managing it down to something smaller. The plaza. The cold. His face when he'd said there isn't one that works. The thing he'd meant underneath it, which she'd understood and been furious at and understood again on the other side of the fury. She was not going to call him. Not today. Not with the board vote still settling and Connolly's response to the documentation still unknown and the actual work still in front of her. She was not going to do what he'd done, make a decision about both their lives from her own emotional state without the other person present, but she had a press conference to give. Priya appeared in the doorway. "Media's assembling downstairs. The business press got wind of the board session. You've got about 20 minutes before they start filing questions we don't control." "I know." Vanessa stood up. She picked up the crayon drawing, looked at it once more, and put it back in the drawer. "I'm going down." "Do you want talking points?" "No." Priya looked at her with the expression she'd had for 4 years. The one that meant she was concerned but had learned to trust the instinct on the other side of the concern. "Okay," she said. The lobby of Hartwell Maritime's headquarters had the high ceilings and industrial accented design that Vanessa had chosen herself years ago because she'd wanted the building to feel like what the company did. Serious, physical, real. The press had gathered in the atrium space, cameras and recorders, and the specific organized chaos of working journalists who knew something had happened and were waiting to find out what. Her communications team was at the edges, and she could see from their expressions that they'd expected her to come down with a prepared statement. She didn't have one. She walked to the small platform her team had set up and looked out at the cameras and the reporters, and through the lobby's glass front wall, the water beyond. "The board met today and voted to continue under current leadership," she said. "I'm not going to read from a prepared statement because I've been reading from prepared statements for 3 weeks, and I think that's been part of the problem." She could hear the shift in the room, the subtle recalibration of reporters who had been expecting corporate language and were getting something else. "There's been a narrative," she said, "about whether my personal life represents a liability for this company, about whether who I am, how I look, who I choose to spend time with, is appropriate for the position I hold." She paused. "I've been advised to address that narrative with measured language, to reassure stakeholders, to contextualize." She looked at the cameras directly. "I'm not going to do that, because contextualizing implies there's something that needs to be put in context, and there isn't." Her voice was steady. She'd worked for this steadiness for a long time. Not the performed steadiness of someone suppressing feeling, but the actual steadiness of someone who had decided what they believed and was standing in it. "I built this company. I built it from a leased terminal, and 11 employees and 12 years of decisions that this board has now validated 7-5. That record speaks for itself, and I'm not apologizing for it. She paused. And if being loved by a good man and his daughter makes me unfit to lead, then the problem isn't me. The room was quiet for a moment. Then two things happened almost simultaneously. A reporter in the front row started typing very fast, and someone at the back began to clap, which spread through the assembled employees who'd gathered at the lobby's edges, Priya among them, and Breck, and Gerald from the dock team who'd driven up specifically because he'd heard something was happening, and 40 other people who'd spent years watching Vanessa Hartwell outwork and outthink every room she'd ever been in. She stepped back from the platform while the questions were still starting. Her communications director would handle the follow-up. She'd said what she'd come to say. The clip was 43 seconds long. It was filmed on someone's phone from the middle of the assembled press, shaky in the first few frames, then steadying as the person realized what they were capturing. By midnight Thursday, it had been viewed 800,000 times. By Friday morning, it was over 3 million. Logan watched it on his phone in his apartment kitchen at 6:15 Friday morning before Mia woke up, with his coffee finally hot for once. He watched it twice. Then he sat with his phone on the table and looked at the kitchen wall. If being loved by a good man and his daughter makes me unfit to lead, then the problem isn't me. He understood several things at once that he'd been understanding separately and had not yet assembled into the complete picture. He understood that Vanessa Hartwell had just stood in her own lobby and said, on camera, to 3 million people in climbing, that she loved him. That she'd said it in that particular order, not spending time with, not my relationship with, loved. Past and present tense together, no qualifier. He understood that she had done this while fighting for her company, which meant she had made a choice about what she was willing to carry publicly, and she had made it without asking him, and it was the same kind of decision he'd made in the plaza, and he had not liked it when he'd done it, and he was not going to like it when he thought about it from her angle. He also understood, clearly, the way the crane cable had been clear in retrospect, that he had been afraid. Not of the board or Connolly or the cost to Vanessa's company, though those were real. Afraid of the specific and ordinary thing, the one that had nothing to do with logistics. Afraid that he was not enough, that a woman who'd built that from nothing would eventually see the gap between her world and his and make the reasonable calculation. He'd turned that fear into sacrifice because sacrifice felt more dignified than fear, and Vanessa had seen through it, and Vanessa had gone ahead and said on camera what he hadn't been able to say in the plaza. He looked at the kitchen wall for a while. He was not going to call her. Not yet. Not because he was still calculating. He was done calculating. But because the right moment mattered, and this was not it. She had just survived the hardest professional week of her life, and she needed 48 hours of that being enough before someone showed up asking for something else. He had learned, slowly and with great difficulty, the difference between doing things on the right timeline and doing them on his own. He had the date of the fundraiser. He had 6 days. He turned his coffee mug on the table and listened to the apartment wake up. The specific sounds of Mia beginning to stir in her room, the small sounds that preceded her appearance, the padding of feet, the door creaking exactly the way it always did. She came around the corner with her hair in total disarray and her penguin costume clutched against her chest, which she'd been sleeping with every night for 3 weeks. She climbed into the chair across from him, arranged herself in the penguin, and looked at him with the direct, clear-eyed assessment that 5-year-olds brought to things adults had been managing to seem normal about. "You're different today," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Did something happen?" He turned his coffee mug. "I watched something Vanessa said on the news." Mia processed this. "Did she say something good?" He looked at his daughter across the table, her wild hair and her penguin costume and her eyes that were just her mother's eyes in a face that was all her own. And he thought about a drawing mailed to a building downtown, 4 words pressed carefully into paper by a hand that didn't know yet that some things were supposed to be harder than that. "Yeah," he said. "She said something real good." Mia nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose position has been confirmed. She arranged the penguin against the back of the chair. "I already knew she was good at talking," Mia said. "She asked Gerald about the fish." Logan smiled. It was the first one in 3 weeks that didn't feel like an effort. She did, he said. The 6 days were not easy days. Logan worked his regular shifts, picked up Mia, made dinner, answered the maintenance requests that kept coming regardless of what was happening in his personal life because hydraulic seals and cable housings did not observe emotional timelines. He filed the final supplemental documentation on the OSHA case. The Port Authority had opened a formal review of the November and January maintenance logs, and Greer had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, which was not something Logan had pursued for satisfaction, but which felt, in the way that correct things sometimes feel, like the ground settling to where it was supposed to be. He watched the clip 3 more times over the 6 days, not obsessively. He was aware enough of himself to keep track of that line, but deliberately, the way you return to something because you're still working out what it means. Each time he watched it, he noticed something different. The first time he'd heard the content. The second time he'd noticed her hands. Still at her sides, no podium grip, no managed stillness. The third time he heard what was underneath the steadiness, the frequency running below the controlled voice that you could only hear if you knew what you were listening for. The fourth time he stopped the clip before it ended because he already knew everything he needed to know, and watching it again was becoming a way of postponing rather than preparing. Mia did not ask him directly about Vanessa after the morning of the clip. She had the instinct that children sometimes have, poorly understood and frequently underestimated by adults, for when a situation was developing, an interference would only slow it down. She went about her days. She drew things. She continued sleeping with the penguin costume. On Thursday evening, she climbed onto the kitchen counter while Logan was making pasta and watched him cook with the evaluating expression of someone composing a report. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He looked at her. "About what?" She gave him the look, the Mrs. Delacroix look. "A little," he said. She considered this. "Vanessa was nervous on our first dinner," she said. "I could tell because she held her water glass like this. She demonstrated a two-handed grip on an imaginary glass, which was specific enough that Logan believed it." "You noticed that?" "I notice things," Mia said, with complete seriousness. He turned back to the pasta. "Yeah," he said. "You do." "She wasn't nervous about the fish," Mia continued. "She was nervous about you, because she kept looking at you when you weren't looking at her." She paused. "You did it too." Logan did not say anything for a moment. The water was starting to boil. "You should say the thing," Mia said. "The thing you haven't said." "How do you know I haven't said it?" "Because you're still nervous." He looked at his daughter on the kitchen counter, 5 years old, legs swinging, completely certain, and thought about all the ways that children understood things that adults spent years learning how to unlearn the fear of knowing. "Get off the counter, Bug," he said. She got off the counter, but she looked at him with the expression of someone who has made their point and is willing to let it stand. The Brightfield Foundation fundraiser occupied the full interior and exterior courtyard of the Eastlake Community Center, which was a building that had been fighting its way through various levels of disrepair for 15 years and which the Foundation's annual event had, over 4 years, transformed into something that actually functioned. Vanessa had started the fundraiser in the Foundation's second year when she'd understood that the shelters and transitional programs she funded needed visibility as much as money, that the families using them needed to be seen by their community rather than quietly helped and kept out of sight, which was how charity usually worked and which she'd always found slightly wrong. The event was organized chaos in the best tradition of underfunded community organizing. There were tables set up in the courtyard with activity stations for children, a craft area, a small stage where a local kids' music group was playing something enthusiastic and rhythmically ambitious, a face painting station that had developed a significant queue. Inside, the main hall held the formal programming, a reception, a series of brief talks from families who'd been supported by the Foundation, a fundraising auction that Vanessa's events team had spent 2 months putting together. She arrived early, as she always did, and spent the first hour doing what she always did at these events, moving through the space, talking to the staff, checking in with the families who'd agreed to speak, making the 1,000 small adjustments that were the difference between an event that worked and one that only appeared to. Priya was there. Breck had sent 2 of his team for general security. Several of her board members had come. including Webb, who was the kind of man who understood that showing up mattered and did it consistently. She had not told anyone Logan was coming. She did not know for certain that he was. She had watched the clip of her own press conference once on Priya's phone, standing in the lobby immediately after, and had felt a specific and uncomfortable feeling that she identified as, "I have just said something very true and very public, and I cannot take it back, and I don't want to, but I also cannot control what it means from here." She had filed that feeling away and returned to work, because the work was what she could move through, and moving through things was what she knew how to do. The week had been full. The Connolly documentation had moved forward. Outside counsel had received partial compliance from Sandor Group's records, enough to confirm the connection Breck had mapped, and the formal tortious interference filing was now a when rather than an if. Hargrove had resigned from the board on Monday, citing personal reasons, which fooled nobody and required no comment. Chen had called Vanessa directly on Wednesday and had a conversation that was uncomfortable for both of them and necessary, and which ended with an agreement to have a fuller conversation in 30 days, which was not resolution but was better than the alternative. Richard Connolly had not called. She expected his lawyers eventually. She was ready for them. The week had been full, and she had moved through it, and on Saturday morning she had driven to the community center and begun setting up. And somewhere in the middle of the morning, she had understood that the thing she was working not to feel was simple anticipation, the ordinary, slightly unbearable kind that had no strategic solution and no way to manage it down to something safer. She was helping a volunteer reposition a table in the courtyard when she saw them. They came through the main gate at 2:15, Logan in a jacket she hadn't seen before, his hands in his pockets, and Mia ahead of him by approximately 4 steps, already scanning the courtyard with the systematic attention of someone identifying points of interest. The kids' music group was between songs. The face-painting queue had gotten longer. Mia spotted it immediately and said something to Logan that Vanessa couldn't hear from across the courtyard, and Logan said something back, and Mia turned around and spotted Vanessa at the table. There was no calculated pause. She just ran. Vanessa had barely straightened up from the table before Mia arrived, and she did the thing she'd done the first time, crouched down, put herself at Mia's level, and Mia came in with the complete physical confidence of a child who has never once been made to feel unwelcome in a hug, and put both arms around Vanessa's neck. "Hi," Mia said, against her shoulder. "Hi, Penguin," Vanessa said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I mailed you a picture," Mia said, pulling back to look at her. "Did you get it?" "I got it. It's on my desk at work." Mia looked satisfied in the deep, uncomplicated way she looked when something had gone according to plan. "I put us all in it," she said, "even though I'm not very good at drawing people yet." "You drew me very accurately," Vanessa said. "Did I get the hair right?" "You gave it a lot of attention." Mia nodded. "That's the most important part." She stepped back and looked at Vanessa with the evaluating clarity that had been her consistent mode since the fish and chips dinner. "Are you still sad?" she asked. Vanessa blinked. "What?" "Daddy said you were going through a hard time. He didn't use the word sad, but that's what he meant." She said it with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had long since stopped pretending that softened language changed the underlying facts. Vanessa looked up. Logan had arrived at the edge of their exchange and was standing with his hands still in his pockets, watching. And his expression was the one she'd learned over months of dinners and waterfront conversations and coffee in the lobby of her building, the one where he was feeling more than he had a ready language for and was making no attempt to hide it and no attempt to perform it either. "I was," she said to Mia, though she was looking at Logan, "for a little while." "Are you better now?" She stood up, looked at Logan directly. The courtyard was full of people and noise and children running between the activity tables, and none of it was particularly relevant to the 4 feet of space between them. "Getting there," she said. He'd rehearsed things, in the loose way that he rehearsed anything. Not a script, just a general direction, a sense of what he needed to say, and approximately how he needed to say it. Standing in the courtyard watching Vanessa hold his daughter, he understood that the rehearsal was not going to be useful. The words he'd prepared were for a conversation, and a conversation required 2 people moving toward each other in roughly equal measure. and what was actually happening had a different shape than that. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him in the lobby coffee shop when he'd said, "I'm not going anywhere," and she'd said, "I know." And both of them had understood that the ground was shifting, and neither of them had said the full thing yet, except now they were on the other side of everything that had happened since then. The board, the plaza, the drawing, the clip. 6 weeks of absence that had been nothing like absence, because something that matters doesn't become absent just because it's physically not in the room. Mia had found the face painting cue and was inserting herself into it with the social confidence that Logan had never been able to fully account for, given that he himself had spent most of his adult life being carefully indirect about things he wanted. "Thank you for coming," Vanessa said. She said it quietly, without the formal register the words usually carried, the way you said something to a specific person rather than as a general statement. "I should have come sooner," he said. She held his gaze. "You came when you came. That's more generous than I deserve." "I'm not being generous, I'm being accurate." She paused. "You were wrong about some of it. You were right about some of it. That's how most things are." He was quiet for a moment. Across the courtyard, Mia had reached the front of the face painting queue and appeared to be directing the volunteer regarding her specific preferences, which the volunteer was taking very seriously. "I saw the clip," he said. She looked at him without changing expression. "I know." 4 times. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "How was it by the 4th time?" "I stopped it early," he said, "because I already had what I needed from it." She waited. "You said it publicly," he said. "The thing. You said it when you didn't have to, when it was the harder option." He looked at her steadily. "And I have been standing in my kitchen for 6 days understanding what that cost and trying to figure out how to say the thing I should have said in the plaza instead of—" He stopped, looked down at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I was afraid," he said. "That's what the calculation was. I dressed it up as math, but it was fear. I was afraid that you'd eventually look at the actual distance between where you are and where I am and make the reasonable decision." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression did what expressions do when a person has been waiting for a specific thing to be said and has been too honest with themselves to pretend they weren't waiting. "Logan," she said, "I ran a logistics company for 12 years. Do you know what the first thing you learn in logistics is?" He shook his head slightly. "That distance is a variable," she said. "Not a barrier. Distance is just one of the things you account for and work with." She paused. "I grew up with nothing. I built what I have from nothing. The idea that you, a man who shows up for his daughter every single day, who filed an OSHA report because it was right, even though it cost him, who drove to a fish and chips restaurant on a Thursday night and let Mia reorganize all the crayons on the table. The idea that you're not at my altitude is—" She stopped, made a small gesture with one hand that encompassed the inadequacy of words for this specific thing. "That's not a calculation I recognize." He was quiet. The kids' music group had started playing again, something with a lot of percussion and questionable pitch accuracy, and the courtyard was full of people moving around them, and not one of them was relevant to this conversation. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly, without architecture or qualification. The way he said the things he was most certain of. The way she'd taught him, without meaning to, without ever telling him to, by saying important things plainly herself. She looked at him. Her eyes were doing something he'd learned to recognize over months of paying attention. The thing they did when she was feeling something fully and not managing it down. "I know," she said. The exact same words, the same ones from the Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill, sitting across from each other for 3 hours. But they meant something different this time, and they both understood that. "I loved you before the plaza," she said. "That was the problem with the plaza." He nodded. He'd known that. He'd known it and had been too afraid of it to let it change the math. "I'm not doing that again," he said. "The math thing." "I know," she said again, softer. "Me neither." They stood in the courtyard with the noise and the movement of the event around them. And then Logan reached out and she reached out and their hands found each other in the space between them. And it was not graceful or cinematic. His hand was cold from the February air. Her grip was firm, the way everything about her was firm. Neither of them made it into more than it was, which was two people deciding, again, to be in the same direction. That was when Mia came back. She had a butterfly painted on her left cheek in orange and blue, and she was moving with the specific velocity of a 5-year-old who has completed one mission and identified the next. She came through the gap between two adults she'd apparently clocked as standing very close together, inserted herself between them with no ceremony, and took one hand from each of them. Logan's left hand, Vanessa's right. She looked up at Logan, then at Vanessa, then at their joined hands on each side of her, both now also holding hers. "Okay," she said. The tone of someone finalizing an arrangement that has been in negotiation long enough. Vanessa made a sound that was half laugh and entirely real, and Logan looked at his daughter standing between them with a butterfly on her face and her hands in both of theirs, completely unself-conscious, completely certain, and felt something in his chest that was too large to hold quietly, but that he was going to have to hold quietly anyway because they were in a courtyard full of people. "She told me," Mia announced, to no one in particular, "that she already picked us. So that's settled." "You told her?" Logan looked at Vanessa. "She asked me directly," Vanessa said. "Last month, when I came to the school show." A pause. "She asked if I was going to stay." "What did you say?" Vanessa looked down at Mia, who was looking back up at her with the expression of someone confirming a known fact. "I said I'd already decided." Mia nodded. "Told you," she said to Logan, in the specific tone of a 5-year-old who has been right about something and intends to note it. "Yeah," Logan said. "You did." The event ran until 7. Vanessa gave a brief speech that she actually wrote herself. No communications team, no approved language, in which she talked about what the foundation did and why it existed. And she said plainly, because she'd stopped being interested in saying anything any other way, that she'd started it because she knew the specific weight of being alone with nothing and having nowhere to go, and that nobody should have to carry that weight alone, and that the measure of a community was not what it celebrated but what it caught when things fell. She did not make it longer than it needed to be. She had learned, somewhere over the last 2 months, that the most powerful things were usually the ones that didn't require extra words. Mia fell asleep in a folding chair near the craft table at 6:45, her butterfly cheek against her own shoulder, and Logan picked her up and carried her without waking her, which he'd gotten very good at over 5 years of practicing the specific combination of speed and stillness required. Vanessa walked out with them to the parking lot, and the night air was cold and clear in the way Seattle could be in March, when the clouds broke, the whole city lit up and reflected in the water to the west. "Thank you for tonight," Vanessa said. "For coming." "Thank you for the foundation," Logan said. "For doing the work." She smiled. The real one, not the professional version, the one he'd been cataloging since the first evening on the waterfront. "It's targeted spending," she said. "Sure it is." They stood in the parking lot with Mia asleep against his shoulder and the cold air around them and the water in the distance. "Thursday," he said. "I want to take you to dinner. Just us. Not a fish and chips situation, a real dinner, and I want to make the reservation myself." She looked at him. "I have a board debrief Thursday morning." "Thursday evening." "I can move the 6 o'clock call." "Good." He paused. "Wear the burgundy dress." She raised an eyebrow. "You remember the dress?" "I remember everything from that night," he said. "Some of it I'd like to replace with better memories." She held his gaze. Something in her expression was warm and direct, and entirely without the self-consciousness that had been present that first evening. The careful, managed quality of a woman who'd been watching for the calculation she expected and bracing for it. That was gone. He'd been watching it go, slowly, over months, and now it was gone. "Thursday," she said. "Burgundy dress." He put Mia in her car seat with the practiced quiet of long habit, buckled her without waking her, and turned back to Vanessa, who was leaning against the passenger side of her car in the parking lot light. He crossed the few feet between them and kissed her, finally, in the parking lot of the Eastlake Community Center, with Mia asleep in the truck and the cold night air, and the distant sound of the event still going inside. It was not the kiss of a first kiss. They were past that. They'd been past that for months in every sense, but the literal one. It was the kiss of something that had been decided and kept getting interrupted and was now finally, simply, happening. She put one hand against his chest and kissed him back, and neither of them made it into more than it was, which was a beginning. He drove home with Mia asleep in the back and the heater going full force on his side and the passenger side cold and empty. And he was okay with the cold and empty this time because it was temporary and he knew it. The thing about fear is that it rarely announces itself as fear. It comes dressed as practicality, as math, as the reasonable calculation of a person who is simply being realistic about circumstances, accounting for variables, protecting the people they love from the cost of what they feel. Logan Pierce had spent 3 weeks calling his fear a sacrifice and had almost convinced himself because he was not a dishonest man, and the fear was convincing. It looked exactly like care. It had all the shape of care. And there is something true underneath it. The people we love are real, their lives are real, the things they've built are real, and we are not wrong to take those things seriously. But there is a particular kind of fear that uses love as its disguise, that borrows the language of protection to avoid the risk of being seen. And the cost of that fear is not only to the person who carries it, the cost is to everyone who has decided, on the other side of it, to stay. Vanessa Hartwell had spent 12 years becoming someone who couldn't be moved. She'd built walls out of performance metrics and board meetings, and the specific armor of a woman who had been disappointed by enough circumstances to decide that the only reliable safety was the kind she constructed herself. She'd been right about the safety. She'd been wrong about what it was keeping out. Because the things you keep out don't limit themselves to the painful ones. Safety built from fear keeps out everything equally, without distinction, and the cost of that isn't visible until the evening you're sitting in your car in the parking lot of a restaurant, having told someone you liked their voice, and it occurred to you that you can't remember the last time you'd sat still in a parked car feeling anything uncomplicated. Mia Pierce was 5 years old, and she had not yet learned to fear the obvious things. She had not learned that love was supposed to be strategic, that attachment required terms, that wanting something clearly and saying so was somehow excessive or embarrassing or a vulnerability to be managed. She had looked at Vanessa across a booth at a fish and chips restaurant and seen someone worth knowing, and she had said so. And then she had mailed a drawing to a building downtown and written 4 words that had no apostrophe and no strategic framing and no careful language because she had not yet decided that careful language was necessary. Families don't quit. It is the simplest possible statement. A child's grammar, a crayon's line, a conviction that had not yet had the opportunity to become complicated. The adults in her life had made it complicated because that is what adults do. They add layers, they account for variables, they calculate the cost, and sometimes the calculation is correct, and sometimes it is the thing that costs them the most. Logan was wrong about the math in the end. The board found its way without him removing himself from the picture because Vanessa was better at her job than anyone's fear gave her credit for. And because the problem was never actually him, it was a man who wanted her contracts and a board that was willing to be used, and an industry that had not yet entirely made room for who she was. That problem didn't go away when Logan went away. It went away when Vanessa walked into a boardroom with a file folder and the specific decision that she was not going to apologize for her life. He had underestimated her. He'd done it with the best possible intentions and out of something that was genuinely love, and it had still been a form of underestimating, and that is the part of the story worth sitting with. Because the people we love are not only the object of our protection. They are people with their own capacity, their own intelligence, their own long record of surviving the things that arrived before us. The most honest thing Logan could have done in the plaza was the thing he finally did in the parking lot of a community center 6 weeks later. Say the true thing, the unstrategized thing, the thing without a calculation underneath it. He loved her. That was the complete truth. Everything else was footnotes. But a year passed the way years do. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, but with the accumulating weight of ordinary things that become the substance of a life. The Connolly lawsuit settled in August, with terms that included a formal acknowledgement by Sandor Group of the campaign's origins, which Vanessa's legal team used to negotiate a significant financial settlement and which Connolly's team tried to keep quiet and largely failed, because these things rarely stay quiet when someone doesn't want them to. Meridian Pacific Freight did not acquire the Tacoma or Bellingham terminal contracts. 2 of their 3 bids for Pacific shipping lanes in the following fiscal year came in below competitive threshold. The industry noticed, as the industry always did, without saying so directly. The OSHA review at the port completed in June. Our review chopuchas. The findings cited systemic failures in the maintenance documentation process at the South Terminal, which was accurate and which resulted in changes that Logan had advocated for over 2 years. Greer was reassigned. Logan was offered the maintenance coordinator position, which would have put him at the desk he'd been frustrated with for years. And he turned it down because he understood himself well enough to know that he did the work he did because he was good with his hands and the desk would have made him someone slightly different in a way he didn't want to be. He negotiated a lead technician classification instead, with a pay adjustment, and went back to the dock. Greer was replaced by a woman named Reyes, who had come up through the union side and who called Logan by his first name and responded to maintenance flags within 48 hours. He considered this a significant improvement. Mia turned 6 in October and had opinions about her birthday party that were extensive and specific and largely reasonable. She had started first grade with the social confidence of someone who had been practicing the art of walking into rooms since birth, and her teacher sent home a note in November that described her as intellectually engaged and occasionally unstoppable, which Logan and Vanessa read at the kitchen table of what was, by that point, an apartment they'd stopped formally distinguishing between. It had happened the way things happen when 2 people stop making a project of keeping themselves separate, gradually, and then not gradually at all. Vanessa kept a drawer at his apartment. Logan kept a key to hers. Mia operated between them with the navigational ease of someone who had decided this was simply how the geography worked, and the adults had largely caught up to her position. Vanessa did not move in. That was a conversation they'd had twice, both times inconclusive, not because either of them was unwilling, but because the logistics, her building, his lease, Mia's school proximity, the question of what made sense rather than what felt urgent, required working through at a pace that neither of them was interested in rushing. They had learned, separately and together, that rushing was a form of fear wearing different clothes. They took the time. The foundation launched 2 new programs that fall, one partnering with 3 Seattle school districts to provide before and after care subsidies for single-parent families, one expanding the transitional housing network to Tacoma and Everett. Vanessa announced the expansion at the 2nd annual Brightfield fundraiser, with Mia in the audience wearing an actual dress instead of a penguin costume, which she had negotiated with Logan for 2 weeks. The dress had penguins on it. It was, she felt, a reasonable compromise. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Brightfield Family Center happened on a Saturday in late November, when the weather had made its usual November promises and broken most of them. The center occupied a building in the Rainier Valley neighborhood, a former community resource space that had been vacant for 3 years and that Vanessa's foundation had spent 14 months renovating with a combination of donor funding and what her operations director called genuinely unreasonable personal involvement from the CEO, who keeps showing up on Saturdays with opinions about the layout. The ceremony was attended by several city council members, a representative from the county executive's office, approximately 30 volunteers, every staff member of the 3 shelters the foundation ran, and a large number of the families who used or had used those programs. Priya was there. Thomas Breck was there. Gerald from Pier 9 Catch was there because Mia had personally extended the invitation, and Gerald was not someone who declined invitations from Mia. Mrs. Delacroix was there in a coat that suggested she'd dressed for something more formal, which she had, because she'd asked Mia what was appropriate, and Mia had said fancy, without specific parameters. Danny Ruiz was there, standing near the back, looking at the whole situation with the expression of a man who has been proven comprehensively right about something and is being relatively restrained about it. Logan stood on the small raised platform beside Vanessa while the photographer from the foundation's communications team arranged and rearranged people for the ceremonial photographs. The scissors were large, the kind used at these events, oversized and silver, that existed only for this specific purpose. and Mia was holding them with the grip of someone who had been told several times already to be careful and was being careful but also was ready to cut the ribbon, and could everyone please stop taking practice photos? "Ready?" Logan said to her. "I've been ready," Mia said. The ribbon was a deep blue, stretched across the main entrance, and on the other side of it was a building that would do specific and concrete good in the lives of people who needed it, which Vanessa had decided years ago was the most honest measure of whether something you built was worth building. The photographer called for the scissors. Mia cut the ribbon with complete confidence and a clean stroke that the photographer caught perfectly, the blue ribbon falling in two pieces, and the small crowd applauded with the particular warmth that comes from people who understand what they're actually applauding. Vanessa looked at the open door of the building. Logan's hand was at her back. Mia was already moving toward the entrance because there was an interior worth exploring, and she was not interested in waiting for the photographs to finish. Mrs. Delacroix had appeared from somewhere to follow her, because that was what Mrs. Delacroix did. "You built this," Logan said, not to fill the space, just because it was true and worth saying. She looked at the building. She thought about the $1,100 at 18. She thought about the data entry job in Bellingham, the community college acceptance letter, the leased terminal, and the 11 employees. She thought about a drawing mailed to an office building, 4 words with no apostrophe, a 5-year-old's complete confidence that the outcome was already decided. "We built some of it," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. No calculation between them, no managed distance, no fear dressed up as something more dignified. Just 2 imperfect people standing in the cold November air in front of something they'd each contributed to making real, which is the only kind of building that actually stands. There is a version of this story that ends with everything resolved and everyone correct, and the world having learned its lesson and adjusted accordingly. That version is a different story. This one ends the way actual things end, not with resolution, but with continuation. The board still had 2 members Vanessa didn't fully trust. Logan still had shifts that started at 5:30 a.m., and a truck with a heating system that only worked on one side. Mia still had opinions about everything, and no mechanism for making them smaller. The industry still had people in it like Connolly, and the world still had the specific cruelty of people who found other people's lives easier to mock than to understand. None of that went away. What went away was the fear. Not all of it. Fear is not the kind of thing that goes away entirely, because it is in some measure the appropriate response to a world that is genuinely uncertain and occasionally very unkind. But the specific fear, the one that wore the face of math, the one that built walls out of distance and called it practicality, that one went away. And in its place was something less dramatic and more durable. The knowledge that the person next to you has seen the actual thing. Not the managed version, not the performed version, not the version that looks best in the available light, and has decided to stay anyway. That knowledge doesn't make the hard things easier, but it makes the hard things possible to stand in without standing in them alone. Mia appeared in the doorway of the new building, face bright, voice carrying across the small courtyard with the absolute confidence of a person for whom important announcements required no preamble. "There's a whole room with books in it," she announced, "and a fish tank. Vanessa, you didn't tell me there was going to be a fish tank." "It was a last-minute addition," Vanessa said. "What kind of fish?" "I don't know. You'll have to ask the volunteer coordinator." "I will," Mia said with complete certainty and disappeared back inside. Logan shook his head slowly. Vanessa made the sound that had become, over a year of accumulation, one of his favorite sounds in the world. Half laugh, entirely real, the one that came out when something had genuinely caught her off guard. They followed Mia inside out of the cold, into the building that was already doing what it was built to do, which was give people a place to land. It was not a perfect ending. It was better than that. It was a real one. The truest thing this story knows is also the simplest. The people worth staying for are the ones who make staying feel like something you chose, not something you survived. That's what Mia understood at 5 that the adults around her took months to learn. That love isn't a calculation you run and a risk you assess. It's a direction you pick and keep picking. Every day, imperfectly, with cold coffee and bad heating systems and fear that doesn't fully go away, and a 5-year-old who will tell you exactly what you're too scared to say and then go look at the fish. If someone in your life has been waiting for you to say the thing, say it. The math will never be clean enough. Say it anyway.